Chapter 319. Eldest brother said gently, after we meet the teacher in Chang'an, we will change the way we address each other. Now you can call me senior brother like youngest brother. As for the itinerary, you don't have to worry about it. For me, cultivation is just a wandering. Moreover, we are going to Tuyang City, so it is convenient for us to return to Chang'an. Listening to the conversation between eldest brother and Shanshan, Ning Ke vaguely sensed something, but subconsciously did not want to think too deeply about it. When he heard that they were going to Tuyang City, he thought that they were probably going to see Xiaoho, and could not help but feel a little worried. He didn't say what he was worried about because no matter how dangerous Sun's Oil City was, he couldn't persuade a person like eldest brother to avoid it. However, his worry was very clear. Eldest brother said, that day at the Hulan Sea, I did not know about the horse gang. Now that I know, and with the fist that he handed over when snatching the tomes of arcane, he has to give an explanation for these things. His tone was calm and gentle, and his speech was still slow. What he said was very simple and clear, because it was based on a simple and powerful logic. No matter if you were from Haotian Taoism or the Devil's Doctrine, no matter if you were from the imperial family or the world's famous general, as long as you wanted to be the enemy of the academy, then you must give an appropriate explanation. In this world, no one had to give such an explanation for a long time, because no one dared to disrespect the back of the mountain of the academy. The last time someone had to give an explanation was the peach blossoms on the West Hill Divine Palace's Peach Mountain. The wind on the wilderness kept howling from day to night, rolling up the thick snow on the surface of the wilderness. However, it could not find a clean place to throw the snow, so it could only fall to the ground helplessly. The snow was still so thick that neither the rolling wheels nor the unwilling hooves of the horses could make too obvious a sound on it. One day, the wind and snow gradually stopped, and the winter sun poked its head out from behind the clouds, casting a sneaky but not enthusiastic look at the ground. Suddenly, there was a dense sound of horse hooves behind a slight hill in the distant wilderness. Although it was dense, it was still clear that there was only one horse, so one could imagine how fast that horse was. The big black horse dragged the heavy carriage forward with difficulty in the snow. It lowered its head and slowly smacked its thick lips, looking extremely listless. When it heard the sound of horse hooves in the distance, it suddenly raised its head and looked in that direction. Its black eyes rolled quickly, looking extremely vigilant and inexplicably excited. A white shadow dashed out from behind the snow-covered hills like an arrow. It was a majestic, snow-white horse. It was the mare that had been in the limelight at the Royal Court horse race but had been defeated by the big black horse in the end. A beautiful girl in a leather coat sat on the back of the horse. She was the princess of the Yueluan kingdom, Lu Qinjia. The hooves of the snow horse were stained with mud, and it was no longer as pure and beautiful as before. It was obvious that it had gone through a long journey and had no time to rest. The face of the girl on the back of the horse was still beautiful, but her eyebrows were full of sorrow and anxiety, and she looked extremely haggard. The world's 3 addicts were recognized as the most beautiful young cultivators in the world. The flower addict could be said to be the prettiest girl among the 3. No one knew why she looked so haggard. The galloping snow horse rushed out of the hills and slowed down when it saw the carriage slowly approaching from the wilderness. When it realized that the carriage was being pulled by the most despicable black horse, it could not help but let out a neigh. It wanted to charge forward and bite it, but at the same time, it subconsciously wanted to avoid it in fear. Its chaotic thoughts affected its movements, and its limbs, which were already weak from the long journey, almost tripped over something. It staggered and almost fell forward. Lu Qinjia frowned slightly. She lifted the reins with her right hand and barely managed to control the horse under her. At this moment, she was only a dozen steps away from the carriage and could see it clearly. The curtains of the carriage were slowly lifted. Lu Qinjia looked out of the window. Her eyes were as cold as the frost in the wilderness. There was pain and intense hatred in the depths of her black eyes. She was completely different from her usual beauty. The curtains were completely lifted. An ordinary-looking scholar looked at her with a gentle expression and nodded in greeting. Lu Qinjia was slightly stunned. Then, she saw Ning Ke and Mo Shanshan behind the scholar. She guessed the scholar's identity. After a moment of silence, she took a light breath and bowed respectfully. Then, she did not say anything to the people in the carriage. She kicked the horse's abdomen with both feet, causing the nervous snow horse to stop confronting the big black horse. Then, they continued into the depths of the wilderness. Where is she going? It was really dangerous for a girl to walk alone in this great wasteland. She is of high status and no one dares to offend her in the Central Plains. However, this is the wilderness. Not to mention the dangerous snowstorm, she would also be in big trouble if she met the desolate men. The desolate men do not have a good impression of the Buddhism and Taoism sections. Ning Ke looked out of the window at the gradually disappearing snow horse and sighed worriedly. There was silence in the carriage. No one responded to his sigh. He was slightly surprised. Then, he realized that eldest brother and Shanshan were looking at him with a very complicated expression. What's wrong? Eldest brother smiled and did not say anything. After a moment of silence, Shanshan said, I realized that Yi Hongyu was right. You are indeed very shameless. Ning Ke was furious and asked, how am I shameless? Shanshan lowered her head and said softly, Qinjia took the risk to ride alone into the wilderness to find her fiancé. She did not want to meet us because she knew that Prince Longqing was seriously injured by you and was on the verge of death. You know very well that this is all your fault. Why are you still hypocritically worrying here? Ning Ke was a little embarrassed. He did not know how to continue the conversation to cover up his shamelessness, so he simply shut his mouth. At this moment, hurried hoofbeats sounded outside the carriage. They opened the curtains and saw that it was the flower addict, Lu Qinjia, who had returned. Lu Qinjia looked at Ning Ke, who was by the window. She suppressed her emotions and asked in a slightly hoarse voice, have you seen him before? Ning Ke looked at the girl on horseback. After a moment of silence, he said, I have not seen him after that. Lu Qinjia did not say who he was, and Ning Ke did not say where he was after that. They both knew that if they were to be too explicit, the hidden resentment between them might explode into a real battle. Lu Qinjia stared at his face and was silent for a long time. Suddenly, she lifted her sleeve and wiped her lips. Then, she lowered her hand to her thigh and covered the blood stain on her sleeve. She asked indifferently, please tell me where he might have gone. On the snow cliff, Ning Ke had shot an arrow through Prince Longqing's chest. After that, a series of unforeseen events had occurred. Now that Yi Hongyu had met up with the papal cavalrymen of the Divine Hall, this news had naturally spread throughout the wilderness. The Divine Hall was indescribably furious. But most importantly, no one knew whether Prince Longqing was dead or alive. The person who was most concerned about Prince Longqing's life was, of course, his fiancée. That was why Lu Qinjia ignored the objections of Aunt Cuni Madi and the people of the Divine Hall and forcefully rode the snow horse into the depths of the wilderness. Ning Ke calmly returned the flower addict's cold gaze. He did not feel any guilt. As the saying goes, he was in the right, so he did not care about the endless hatred and murderous intent in her eyes. He said, I was too far away from him that day, so I do not know if he is still alive. You should ask Yi Hongyu about this. Hearing his reply, especially the calmness in his voice, Lu Qinjia lowered her eyelids slightly. Then, she silently lifted the reins and continued into the depths of the wilderness. The figure of the horse and the person seemed exceptionally lonely and sorrowful. In the northernmost part of the Bishiyanki mountain, thick snow covered everything between heaven and earth, half covering a simple leather tent. Other than the desolate men, no one could survive in such a cold place. A father and son from the desolate man lived in the tent. They belonged to the last tribe of the desolate men to migrate south. They had just completed their winter rites and were preparing to return to the settlement of their tribe. But before that, they had to first solve a problem in the tent. That problem was a young man from the Central Plains. The young man's clothes were extremely tattered, but one could tell from the bright yellow shreds that they were very expensive. Presumably, his identity was not ordinary. However, his current appearance was too miserable. Because of the cold weather, the miserable large arrow wound on his chest and abdomen did not fester or grow worms. Instead, it was frozen into something that looked like bacon. It looked extremely terrifying. The father and son found him in the thick snow in the mountain. Although he was obviously from the Central Plains, the father and son followed the tradition of the desolate men when they went hunting and dragged him back to their tent to treat him. However, after the young man woke up, he still looked like a dead man. He stared at the linoleum on the top of the tent with his eyes wide open. No matter what the father asked him, he refused to speak. The father and son could not be bothered with him. They continued to go in and out of the snowy mountains every day, looking for small beasts that were looking for traces. They worked hard to complete the hunting tasks required for the winter rites. When they dragged their heavy and tired bodies back to the tent, they casually fed the young man a bowl of meat soup and did not do anything else. It was unknown whether it was because he was blessed by Haotian or because there was a strange source of vitality in his body, but the young man did not die. He only became abnormally thin, with deep eye sockets and protruding bones. The once beautiful face of the Son of God gradually became ugly and gloomy. One day, the young man finally sat up. He panted violently and painfully, caressing the horrifying hole in his abdomen. While the desolate man father and son were not paying attention, he took out a hunting knife from the corner of the tent and slashed at the strong desolate man father. The desolate man father did not expect that the young man he saved would sneak up on him. He only had time to turn his body when the hunting knife came at him. Fortunately, the young man from the Central Plains had suffered such a serious injury and was extremely tired and weak. It was difficult for him to even pick up the hunting knife, so he did not have the slightest bit of strength. In addition, the desolate man's skin was as hard as iron, so the knife only made a very shallow white cut on the desolate man's shoulder. With a crisp slap, the desolate man boy, who was about to turn 12, knocked the young man from the Central Plains to the ground with a sullen face. He then began to curse loudly. However, the desolate man boy's voice was clear and bright, and his pronunciation of the Central Plains language was stiffer than his father's. His cursing was as clear as the shattering of an icicle, but it did not sound too dirty. The young man from the Central Plains did not listen to what the desolate man boy was cursing. He fell to the ground and coughed violently in pain. He looked at his trembling hands and his eyes were so dim that they looked like candles that could be extinguished at any time. "I'll definitely have to drink tonight and tomorrow night. I didn't drink much during the annual meeting, but who would have thought that the world is unpredictable? Umitba, it's still the same old saying, I work hard and keep updating. The people around me really saw my hard work." My comrades at the annual meeting were all shocked, thinking that old cat really didn't stop updating. Sigh, it seems like my laziness has become a thing of the past. I need to change, just like that young man in the wilderness. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 320. There was dead silence in the tent. The young man looked at the hunting knife on the ground without saying a word, and no emotion could be seen on his face. After a long time, he seemed to recall something from the past, and a faint glimmer of light returned to his eyes. He held on to the ground and sat up with difficulty. He looked at the desolate man father and son and let his usual solemn and sacred expression return to his face. He said solemnly, "So sneak attacks are not that interesting." It was a very strange sentence, but he said it very seriously and solemnly. His tone was still the same as it had been for the past 10 years, calm and gentle, but with an innate arrogance and condescending indifference. However, he was no longer the beautiful divine son of West Hill, but a withered and filthy wanderer. Therefore, this expression on his face was extremely incongruous and even a little ridiculous. The desolate man father and son thought he was ridiculous, but they did not laugh. The desolate boy picked up the hunting knife on the ground and walked up to him, wanting to cut off his head like the beasts in the snow mountains. Seeing the shadow of the hunting knife coming towards him, the noble young man who had fallen to the wilderness finally felt the shadow of death, just like when he felt the arrow on the snow cliff. In fact, he was not unfamiliar with this feeling. In the first half of his life, he had seen the fear and confusion of countless prisoners when they were about to die in the serene prison. However, at that time, he had never associated this feeling with himself. The young man from the Central Plains was not afraid of death, at least he thought he was not. However, he really did not want to die in the hands of a desolate man-boy. This way of dying was too absurd and unbefitting of his identity. He did not die because the desolate man-father stopped his son. The desolate man-father looked at his son and shook his head. He lectured, "Since we desolate men have saved people, there is no reason for us to kill them. Moreover, this young man from the Central Plains is obviously crazy. It is not auspicious to kill a madman." The desolate man-boy asked, "Then what should we do?" "We can't raise a madman." The desolate man-father explained, "Since he wants to kill us, we can't raise him anymore. Throw him out and let him fend for himself. Yama will decide whether he lives or dies. This is the fairest way." The temperature of the tent was extremely low. The young man was seriously injured and was on the verge of death. Without the warmth of the tent and the bonfire, he would have died in a short while. The desolate man father and son knew this very well. However, even if the desolate man had compassion, they would not be stupid enough to overflow. The father carried the young man out of the tent like a chick and threw him far away into a pile of snow. That young man was naturally Prince Longqing. On the snow cliff in the depths of the Tianqi Mountains, he was shot through the chest by Ning Kei's primordial 13 arrow when he was at the critical juncture of breaking through the knowing destiny state. That arrow not only almost killed him on the spot, but also destroyed his cultivation state and confidence. History had already proven that being disturbed by external objects at the critical juncture of breaking through the realm would have serious consequences, such as being devoured by the qi of heaven and earth. Ning Kei's primordial 13 arrow was definitely not an ordinary external object or inner devil. The impact on Prince Longqing was not as simple as being devoured by the qi of heaven and earth. Because of that arrow, he could no longer cultivate for the rest of his life. In other words, he had turned from a powerful cultivator who could enter the knowing destiny state the fastest into an absolute wastrel. Some people were still alive, but they were already dead. They were even more painful and desperate than death. That day on the snow cliff, Prince Longqing was such a person. When the Tao addict pulled him back from the brink of death, he fell off the snow cliff like a walking corpse and walked towards the north of the wilderness in a daze. He went north because the night was longer there. Prince Longqing felt that the light of Haotian had abandoned him, so he chose to die on the other side of the night. At least this way, he would not stain Haotian's eyes. It was cold and snowy. He thought that he could become a zombie in the snow at any time. However, he did not know whether it was because of the pure Taoist aura that Yi Hongyu had poured into his body or the effect of the pill from the Jishou Abbey. He did not fall down. He walked painfully for a few days and then passed out in the mountains. If nothing else had happened at that time, when the pure Taoist aura in his body was gradually released and the effect of the pill completely disappeared, he would eventually become a corpse in the deep snow in the north of Tianqi Mountain. No one would ever discover his death. It would not be until thousands or tens of thousands of years later when the weather changed again and the snow melted and the frozen corpse was revealed. However, who would remember a person called Prince Longqing thousands of years ago? After being rescued by the desolate father and son, Prince Longqing was still perplexed, but his desire to die had faded a little. Because no matter who it was, after experiencing a soulless struggle between life and death, they would always have stronger feelings for the human world. Being able to live made him feel good to the desolate man, father and son. However, deep in his bones, his hatred for the devil's doctrine and contempt for the desolate man still existed. The stronger the gratitude in his heart, the more pain and torment he felt. After a long period of silent thinking, he decided to defeat the desolate man, father and son, and then said something that he had never had the chance to say. "I forgive your sins on behalf of Haotian." Prince Long Qing, who was in the tent, was in a very chaotic state of mind and logic. That state was between life and death, between light and darkness, between gratitude and hatred, between glorious memories and embarrassing reality. It was precisely because of this that he made such an inexplicable choice. The fact that he was thrown out of the tent made Prince Long Qing sober up. He clearly remembered many things. He was no longer the West Hill divine son who had plucked peach blossoms in his hands. He was no longer the prince of Yen Kingdom who had lived a luxurious life since childhood. He was no longer the person who was qualified to be the one who was expected to revive the Yen Kingdom. Instead, he was just a wastrel whose snow mountain and ocean of qi had been destroyed and could no longer cultivate. He lay in the cold snow, not knowing whether he was dead or alive. Images of the past flashed quickly in his mind. It was unknown whether it was because of these images or the cold, but his body became more and more stiff, his thin and dirty cheeks became paler and paler, and the luster in his eyes became weaker and weaker. Prince Long Qing, who used to be Prince Long Qing, was now like a poor beggar, silently waiting for his death on the snowfield where few people could be seen. However, fortunately, or extremely unfortunately, Yama, who was in charge of the night and death, seemed to hate the faint smell of light that still remained in this beggar, and refused to give him a sweet kiss. Prince Long Qing sat until the early morning. His eyelashes moved slightly, and the slender and charming eyelashes fell with the rustling of frost. He indifferently looked at his chest and found that he was actually not dead. He slowly stood up and continued his journey that had been interrupted for some time. He walked toward the far north that was still immersed in the darkness of the night. Under the interaction of the wind, snow, and cold, the luxurious coat finally could no longer support itself. Threads of it fell behind him, and the bright yellow color had long faded. There was only a close-fitting undergarment left on his body, which was stained with black blood and black soil. It was so dirty that it was hard to tell whether it was blood or soil. He walked until noon, and the blazing sun shone on his head. However, there was no heat at all, as if it did not exist. He weakly looked up at the sky and squinted with difficulty. Then, he used all his strength to take a step forward. He felt something strange on the sole of his foot. When he looked down, he found that his shoe had been broken, and a sharp piece of ice had pierced deeply into the sole of his foot. However, he could no longer feel the pain. Prince Long Qing weakly continued to walk with thin clothes, bare feet, and a seriously injured body. He did not know where he was going. He just followed the intuition deep in his heart, aimlessly but never deviated from the direction of the north. The darkness there had always been attracting him before his death, just like the light in the past. He did not know how long he had walked. Because he was too weak, he walked slowly, so he did not know how many miles he had walked. He did not feel hunger or pain, and those instinctive human desires seemed to gradually fade under the double torture of despair and death. However, he had to continue to walk north. He did not need to eat, but he had to support his body that could fall at any time. Therefore, he broke a branch on the road and used it as a walking stick. It was difficult for trees to survive in the wilderness of the far north. There were no thick branches. The thin branch only supported him for a few thousand feet before it broke. His body fell heavily on the snow, and some gray blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. He struggled to get up, and his face was still expressionless. He stared blankly at the seemingly endless wilderness in the north, sighed softly, and then sat down. He did not know how many days he had walked, and how many miles he had walked, but he still did not walk into death, nor did he walk to the dark north. He felt a little regretful. He quietly looked up at the sky, watching the twilight gradually replaced by night. He sat in the cold wilderness for an entire night until the morning arrived. The first ray of sunlight shone on the monotonous snowy plain and shone on his slightly squinted eyes. Because he no longer had eyelashes, his eyelids appeared particularly smooth. It's finally dawn. He looked at the first ray of light in the east and murmured in a hoarse voice, how good it would be if the sky would never be bright again. Why am I so afraid of seeing the sky now? The hurried sound of horse hooves came from the south. Prince Long Qing looked at the east in a daze, completely ignoring the sound coming from behind him. The sound of horse hooves came closer and closer. There was still a long distance between them. Lu Qinjia jumped down from the back of the great snow horse and rushed to his back. Then, she slowly squatted down and opened her arms to hug his body from behind. The great snow horse swayed and almost fell on the snowfield. It had been running for thousands of miles non-stop for days and nights. No matter how spirited it was at its weakest. Lu Qinjia hugged him gently and pressed her face against his. She did not dare to use force, but she also did not want to let go. It was as if she was worried that the man she loved would disappear again if she let go. She walked towards the darkness. After these days, a smile finally appeared on Prince Long Qing's face. He looked at the faint morning light in the east and gently sniffed the scent coming from the side of his face. He said in a hoarse voice, "Don't you feel that you're hugging a corpse?" Lu Qinjia lowered her head and said with a smile, "If you were willing to look back at me, you would know that I look terrible now. The coming night is indeed a story with love. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 321. She was the most beautiful flower addict among the 3 addicts in the world. After hearing the sad news, she did not hesitate to change into a plain robe and rode a white horse into the wilderness. She galloped for thousands of miles without rest. Her face was covered with frost and dust, but she was not haggard. Compared to her usual beautiful face, she was indeed ugly. Prince Long Qing did not turn back to look at her face. His gaze moved from the morning light in the east to the dark night in the north. He sniffed the slightly sour smell and felt a slight sourness in his heart. He knew that his fiancée loved cleanliness the most. For her to have the stench of sweat in such a cold winter day, one could imagine how she had endured the entire journey. Because of the sourness in his heart and the exhaustion in his body, he suddenly felt tired. He looked down at the ugly wound on his chest and said indifferently, "I once had a dream." Lu Qinjia did not know what he wanted to say. She only hugged him gently and pressed her face against his thin and dusty face. "When I was climbing the last few steps in the back of the mountain of the academy, I had the deepest dream. In that dream, I faced the most difficult choice in my life. However, I did not have much time to think before I reached for the Taoist sword at my waist." Prince Long Qing looked at her hands that were wrapped around his chest and said in a hoarse voice, "Then, I pulled out the sword and pierced it through your chest. Even though you looked at me so sadly, I still did not turn back." A gust of morning wind blew. It was cold even though there was no snow. Lu Qinjia's body stiffened and she hugged him tighter. This was because she could hear some emotions in his indifferent voice that made her feel afraid. "In fact, I was in pain too. However, I did not regret it because I firmly believed that it was the right choice." Prince Long Qing raised his hand with difficulty and pointed to the black hole on his chest. He said, "After many years in that strange dream, my chest was pierced through by a wooden sword, just like how I pierced you in the dream. I did not die. A flower grew out of my chest, a flower made of gold. That golden flower was so beautiful and could even be said to be perfect. It reflected the light of Haotian and was incomparably solemn. The golden flower on my chest is my compensation for giving up everything to serve Haotian. I hold the Taoist sword in my hand and walk on the path of light with the golden flower blooming on my chest. However, what makes me sad, regretful, and even angry is that I paid so much in my dream but still could not walk to the end. Why is that? Prince Long Qing's eyes reflected the brightening morning light in the east. His eyes were as dark as a will-o'-the-wisp, without the slightest emotion that a human should have. There was only endless despair and confusion about God. Why is this happening? Is absolute light absolute darkness? But what I see and what my Tao heart feels is light. Why did great heaven give me such a harsh trial? Does he think that my Tao heart is not firm enough? I have been so perfect since I was young. Why do I have to suffer so many setbacks? The light in his eyes gradually faded and became as dim as the first rays of dawn in the north. After a moment of silence, he laughed somewhat crazily and raised his right hand with difficulty to cover the pitiful hole that looked like the lips of a dying old man. He said, "Until Ning Ke pierced through my chest with an arrow on the snow cliff. There was no flower made of gold outside the hole, only a flower of despair. Only then did I realize that there is no such thing as perfection in this world. All the pride and glory in the past was just a footnote for the final destruction. Just like the Taoist temple on the Peach Mountain, the more beautiful the carvings are, the more emotional it will be when it collapses." Lu Qingjia's arms, which were hugging him, began to tremble slightly. She could not understand what he was saying. The words were clear, but the meaning behind them was so fragmented and illogical. It was so fragmented that she could not understand it. She could only feel the despair and self-abandonment in it. Prince Long Qing said slowly and desolately, "I know that you truly pity me. But the current me and the future me do not have the right to accept your pity. So don't pity me. Just accompany me for a while." He slowly pulled Lu Qingjia's hands away from his neck and said, "Don't worry about me committing suicide. Even though I have nothing left in this world and have already given up all hope, I will not seek death. Haotian seems to think that I have not been punished enough and does not want me to die just like that." The heavily injured Prince Long Qing did not have any strength at all. But when his fingers touched the back of Lu Qingjia's hand, she did not resist at all and let go. Lu Qingjia knelt beside him and looked at the side of his face, which was no longer handsome and even looked exceptionally cold and ugly. There were no tears or sadness in her eyes, only love and pity that came from the depths of her heart. "You just said that there is nothing perfect in this world. That means that there is nothing that cannot be changed. Whether it is your arrow wound or your future cultivation, it will definitely return to normal. The Hierarch Lord can cure you, and I can also ask my aunt to find the way to the Xiankong Temple. The Vedanta of the Buddhism sect will definitely have a way to cure you." Prince Long Qing said, "When a person is about to die, his Taoist heart must be clear. I have never been as weak as I am now, but I have also never understood myself as well as I do now. When my sense of perception was destroyed when I broke through the realm, I have no hope of cultivation in this life. The Hierarch Lord cannot do it. Even the divine priest of light in the U prison cannot do it, and those silent fellows in the Buddhism sect cannot do it either. Don't have any false hopes. No one can change my fate." He looked into the distance and said faintly, "On the stone outside the firewood gate in the back of the mountain of the academy, the headmaster of the academy should have left 4 words for me. I had originally forgotten them, but a few days ago, before I died, I somehow remembered them. Those 4 words were, 'A gentleman does not fight.' At that time, I did not understand the true meaning of these 4 words, but I thought I understood it very well. That was why I felt unreconciled and even contemptuous towards it. Instead, I wanted to fight even more. Only now do I understand that the headmaster of the academy was talking about my character, and a person's character determines his fate. I have been fighting all my life. Although you all do not know the true relationship between my brother Chongming and me, I have indeed been fighting with him, and the whole world knows that I am fighting with him for the throne of the secular world. In the Revelation Institute, I also fought. I wanted to fight for the position of the chief disciple, because I was not willing to accept that I would be humiliated and ridiculed once the divine priest who doted on me lost his power. I fought for my dignity then. In the judicial department, I fought even more. Facing a crazy woman like the Tao addict, if I did not fight for power, how would I be qualified to sit opposite her? How would I be qualified to sit on the seat of heavenly black jade in the future? I was once glorious and victorious. I thought that was the result of fighting. Now that I have fallen into the abyss of despair, I finally understand that the headmaster of the academy has long seen through everything. All the sins and despair are the result of my own fighting. It is better not to fight. Lu Qinjia knelt beside him weakly. She lowered her head and listened to him muttering to himself. The hair floating in front of her forehead swayed like lifeless grass in the wilderness. Her face was pale, without a trace of blood. Prince Longqing smiled foolishly. His pale smile looked abnormally desperate. He said, "Do you know? I used to really think that I was the guardian of light. No matter how many people I killed or how many bloody things I did in your eyes, my Taoist heart was still clean. Because I believed that I was carrying out the will of Haotian. Since I was the guardian of light and carrying out the will of Haotian, of course I had to be a perfect person. That was why I paid great attention to my appearance, dressing and speech. I rarely drank to prevent myself from messing up. I was gentle to others but strict to myself. I was particular about my demeanor. Even when I was dealing with the troublesome remnants of the devil's doctrine, I did not make a sneak attack. That time at the back of the mountain of the academy, I was the first to arrive. But in order to maintain my demeanor, I waited for a long time for Ning Quebec. In the end, the most troublesome and shameless enemy of my life came. Prince Longqing looked at the dimly lit sky and said, "After I was injured, I thought I would die. But I did not die for no reason. So I thought that maybe Haotian did not abandon me. It just pointed me to a different path. So I wanted to try to go into the darkness. I didn't want to care about my demeanor anymore. I gathered a lot of strength and courage. I picked up the hunting knife and chopped at the head of a 12-year-old desolate man-boy. But do you know what happened? I did not succeed. I was even willing to give up the light. I was already shameless. I had already planned to surrender to the darkness and walk to the other side of the Absolute. But why did I not succeed? There was great fear in Prince Longqing's eyes. He murmured, "It turns out that this is not a story of Haotian's trial of believers. It is not a story of falling from light to darkness. It is not a story of pain but still hope. This is just a story, forgotten by Haotian. It is indeed painful to struggle between the light and the darkness. It is even more painful to surrender to the darkness. But that kind of pain is alive. It is alive. But what about me now? Even if I want to surrender to the darkness, I am still rejected. It turns out that I am not qualified to be abandoned by Haotian. I am just a small figure forgotten by Haotian in the north of the wilderness." He coughed painfully. His skinny body was as hunched as an old man's. It was as if he was about to become a pile of snow in the wilderness. Lu Qinjia looked at him in a daze. Suddenly, the sadness in her eyes faded. She slowly stood up and steadied herself after swaying a little. She said calmly and firmly, "I will kill Ning Ke first." Is there any meaning to this? Prince Longqing stood up with difficulty. He turned around and held her haggard but still beautiful face. His dirty fingers caressed her skin slowly. He said, "There is no meaning to this." Lu Qinjia looked at the face that was so close to her. She realized that this face had become extremely unfamiliar. Her heart ached and she bit her lower lip. She knew that if she could not get rid of the despair and inner demons in his heart, she would not be able to bring him out of the wilderness. But she also knew that there was no way for him to return to the way he was before. Prince Longqing had known her for many years. From the palace of the Yueluan kingdom to the Revelation Institute, they had been in love for many years. He knew very well how passionate the flower addict could be. He could guess what she wanted to do just by looking at her expression. He took 2 steps back with difficulty and distanced himself from her. He shouted coldly, "Don't try to knock me out. I am a useless person. But I don't want to be like those useless people who say things like 'Don't pity me and please stay away from me.' I just want to say a few simple words to you, can't I? Why do you have to do such disgusting things like those scholars and beauties? Do you want me to cry like an idiot?" Prince Longqing's voice was hoarse as he roared angrily at her. Lu Qinjia looked at him with a pale face. She held her hands in front of her chest as if she was begging. It also seemed like she was trying to use this action to soothe the pain in her heart. It also seemed like she was trying to show that she would not knock him out. There was a deathly silence in the cold wilderness. After a long period of silence, Prince Longqing restrained the crazed anger on his face. There was no life or hope on that once perfect face. He spoke slowly, coldly, and with a despairing gaze, he said, "Don't pity me. Don't make me think that you pity me. It would have been better not to have met you today." Lu Qinjia did not say anything. She slowly lowered her hands in front of her chest. Longqing turned around and picked up the broken branch. He continued walking towards the north. Lu Qinjia was silent for a moment. Then, she followed him towards the north. Longqing's injuries were too serious and his walking speed was too slow. After a long time, he had only walked a few hundred feet. He fell 3 times along the way. The branch flew far away and he no longer had the strength to pick it up. The wound on his chest split open again. Blood began to seep out of his thin clothes and condensed into beads of frozen blood when it came into contact with the cold wind. Lu Qinjia followed behind him. Her face grew paler and paler, but she did not go forward to help him. Prince Longqing was tired. He sat on the hard ground of the wilderness. He grabbed a handful of snow with his right hand and stuffed it into his mouth to chew. Then, he tried to stand up and continue walking north. Unexpectedly, he did not stand firm and fell heavily to the ground again. He angrily hammered the ground beside him. However, because he was too weak, the remaining snow on the ground did not even splash up. Lu Qinjia looked at him silently from behind. Longqing knew that she was behind him. After panting for a moment, he suddenly roared, "I've said what I needed to say. You've already met me. Why are you still following me? If you continue to follow me, I'll die in front of you." Lu Qinjia's body swayed slightly, but she quickly regained her balance. A look of determination flashed across the girl's beautiful face. Even the most delicate flower had thorns and stems. She had her own limits. She looked at the back of the dog-like man in front of her and shouted, "Then die in front of me." Prince Longqing's body stiffened slightly. Lu Qinjia's face was pale, but she stubbornly refused to cry. She shouted, "We've been together for so many years, but you still won't let me see you clearly. So, you won't even let me see you die. But I really want to see you. So, if you want to die, then die in front of me. I'll collect your corpse and then go back to the Central Plains to remarry." Longqing was silent for a moment. Then, he laughed crazily. "What a crazy woman. Even if you remarry, no one would dare to marry you." Lu Qinjia shouted, "Remarrying is marrying someone else. You'll be dead by then. You don't have to worry about that." Longqing was silent and continued walking north. Lu Qinjia did not speak either. She silently followed him north. The great snow horse followed behind them tiredly. From dawn to dusk, the wind and snow rose again in the wilderness. The cold wind was biting. The snow pressed down on them. They continued walking together. I should be able to write more at night. It should be around 8 or 9 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chijien.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 322. They continued to head north. Prince Longqing walked alone in the wind and snow. The flower addict, Lu Qinjia, followed silently from afar. The snow horse kicked its hooves soundlessly to get rid of its fatigue. They walked from dawn to dusk and then from dusk to dawn. They did not know how many days they had walked and how far they had walked. The dark night in the north of the wilderness was still so far away. Along the way, Prince Longqing chewed on snow when he was thirsty and swallowed a few mouthfuls of saliva when he was hungry. The more he walked, the weaker he became. It was as if he could collapse at any time. Lu Qinjia had been waiting silently for that moment to come. However, although he fell many times, he climbed up with difficulty every time. She did not know how such a weak body could contain so much vitality. Lu Qinjia looked at the figure dozens of feet away in silence. She maintained a distance and did not move forward because she knew that he did not like it. She chewed on snow when she was thirsty and took out rations from the horse's back when she was hungry. Looking at the figure that was weak because of hunger, it took a lot of effort to suppress the urge to give him food. They walked from the beginning of the snow until it stopped and from the beginning of the wind until it stopped. The two of them and the horse were still in the cold black and white wilderness. They could faintly see the majestic Tianqi mountains in the distance. It seemed as if they could not walk out of this hopeless world no matter what. One day, Prince Longqing suddenly stopped and looked at the unreachable night in the north. His fingers that were as thin as a withered tree trembled slightly and then relaxed. A branch that he had picked up a few days ago fell from his palm and hit his foot. He looked down at his grayish-white toenail and realized that it was not bleeding. He raised his head and continued to squint at the night in the north. Then, he slowly turned around and looked at Lu Qinjia who was dozens of feet away. In a hoarse voice, he said, "I'm hungry." Lu Qinjia's eyes became wet and she almost cried. She forced herself to calm down and took out the rations with trembling hands. She softened them with the warm water that she had secretly prepared every day and then brought them to him. He did not say anything else. He looked at her no longer tender and rough palm and hurriedly swallowed the rations. Then, he rubbed his throat in satisfaction and continued on his way. But this time, he did not go north. There was no sign, no reason, and no words. He thought that he had been abandoned by Haotian and no longer tried to go to the embrace of the night. Instead, he turned around and went south to the central plains. Lu Qinjia stared blankly at his back. Her joyful mood gradually turned cold. She was sure that Longqing had not decided to regain his vitality. Instead, he had truly lost all hope, including the darkness. Yes, he was still alive. But was this living Longqing? She led the snow horse and followed behind Longqing. She peeked at his face and whispered, "Actually, it's good to go back to capital Cheng. When we were on Peach Mountain, you often said that you missed the garden of the imperial palace. Shall I go with you?" Prince Longqing glanced at her indifferently. It was no longer the arrogant indifference that came from the bone marrow, but the indifference of a passerby who had given up on himself. He mocked, "How could you be so stupid? Why would he go back to capital Cheng? Assassinated by those ministers loyal to Chongming? Or was he ordered to die by imperial father for the sake of the bigger picture?" Lu Qinjia was stunned and immediately came to her senses. She understood that if Longqing returned to the capital of the Yan kingdom, he might not even be able to see the next morning. That was because he was not the Westhill divine son who had the support of the divine hall. He was just an ordinary person who was involved in a dangerous fight for the throne. How could he be lucky? The hierarch has always admired you. Besides, there's also the divine priest of judgment. She said carefully. Idiot, do you really think that Peach Mountain is a place of light and holiness? Prince Long Qing looked at her and said mockingly, what appreciation and value are all based on your strength. Yi Hongyu won't lie, and she doesn't have to. I've already been crippled by Ning Kei's arrow. What use do I have to the divine hall? Do you really think that just because I'm good-looking, I can really help the temple attract believers? Those old guys on Peach Mountain have no respect for anyone but Haotian. How could they have sympathy like you? These words were harsh and vicious, but there was no way to refute them. Lu Qinjia lowered her head and muttered, can we go to Yueluan if we really can't do it? You know that I've prepared a garden in Jingshan that I've been waiting for you to see. She knew that she had said something wrong the moment she mentioned Yueluan. As expected, Prince Long Qing's expression grew colder and colder. His eyes even revealed a look of disgust. He stared at her and said resentfully, I'm not going north because you, an annoying woman, are always following me. How could Yama see my sincerity? I don't want to die, so I can only go south. It's that simple. But my not wanting to die has nothing to do with you. So if you're willing to give me food, you'd better shut up. Lu Qinjia slowly clenched her fists and pursed her lips. She looked at the shadows cast by the setting sun in the wilderness. She looked at her own shadow and the shadow of the man opposite her. She realized that no matter how hard she tried, they could not overlap. All the way to the south, and further south. The wind and snow had stopped and there were signs of beasts in the wilderness. The longer they walked south, the closer they were to the prosperous and real human world. However, the shadows of two people and a horse on the surface of the wilderness maintained a sad distance. The Yen Kingdom was located at the northern end of the mainland. It shared a border with the grasslands left King's Palace. There was also the terrifying Tang Empire beside it. Therefore, it was difficult to say that the country was strong and the people were not rich. It was the end of the year and the cold of winter was thick. Homeless beggars could be seen everywhere in capital Cheng. A skinny beggar might arouse the sympathy of the people, but 100 skinny beggars would only arouse the disgust and fear of the people. The restaurant owners on the streets and alleys of capital Cheng could only see beggars. Naturally, they would not be able to enjoy giving out porridge like their counterparts in Chang'an. Whether the beggars could fill their stomachs depended on their own ability. A beggar as thin as a ghost was walking aimlessly in the streets of Qingjing with a broken bowl in his hand. He didn't attract anyone's attention. The familiar street scene didn't attract his attention either. His attention was completely attracted by the aroma coming from the restaurant of the hotel. It was a pity that he didn't have a unique knack for begging like those old beggars. His coat still smelled sour in the cold wind, and his dirty hair was more tangled than the rope at the city gate. It was impossible for him to enter those places. He was chased out by 3 restaurants in a row. The waiter of the last restaurant even hit him hard on the thigh with a stick and then kicked him to the middle of the street. The skinny beggar's face was covered with dirt and it was impossible to tell his age. He stood in the middle of the street with his hands on his waist and a bowl that was even more broken. He cursed at the restaurant in the middle of the street. His foul language was even more stinky than the dirt on his body. He did not run away until the waiter rushed out with a stick. His original identity and demeanor were nowhere to be seen. At the other end of the street, the flower addict, Lu Qinjia, was leading the snow horse. She looked at the scene in a daze. Her right hand gripped the reins tightly and her eyes were slightly wet. However, she did not cry because she still had hope. On the way back from the wilderness, she had already washed up and changed into clean clothes. However, because of her unhealthy complexion and thin figure, she looked particularly haggard, which made her look even more pitiful. If it weren't for the snow horse beside her, which was obviously a precious animal, who knew how many city guards or people in Jianghu would have bad intentions towards her. These few days, she had seen Long Qing return to the capital of the Yan kingdom incognito. She had seen him wandering the streets and the lowest level of the secular world. She had seen him being beaten by the waiters of the restaurants with sticks. She had seen him struggle to survive. There were many times when she could not help but want to go up to him, but she did not dare to. This was because on the way back from the wilderness, Long Qing no longer asked her for food when he saw people. Every time she wanted to help, he would scream crazily. He would even pick up anything that he could touch and throw it at her, whether it was rocks or mud, except for the broken bowl that he used to beg for food. Lu Qinjia was very sad. She was sad because of Long Qing's current situation. She was sad because Long Qing had driven her away. More importantly, she realized that Long Qing could only throw rocks and mud at her like a naughty child or a real beggar. Every time she thought that Long Qing would also realize this reality, he was sensitive and proud. How painful and uncomfortable would he be? Prince Long Qing, who had become a beggar, finally managed to get half a frozen steamed bun from a woman's basket in the evening. He proudly stuffed the steamed bun into his arms. He thought of the half-urn of cabbage and clapper soup that he hid in his residence. He hummed a song that he had heard from his classmates in the Revelation Institute in West Hill and left the city in his old shoes. There was a Taoist temple outside the city. Prince Long Qing passed by the Taoist temple but did not enter. He did not even look at the Taoist temple. In the past, if the Taoist temple knew that Prince Long Qing was outside, it would have cleared out the entire temple and paved the way to welcome him as if he was an ancestor. However, a few days ago, when the little Taoist learned that he wanted to stay in the Taoist temple, his eyes were filled with disdain. That was why Long Qing did not stay in the Taoist temple. He stayed in an abandoned Buddhist temple outside the city. Now, Long Qing was very dirty. His hair was unkempt and his face dirty. His hair was knotted and could not be untied. Fortunately, it was winter, so the wounds on his chest and abdomen did not rot and there were no mosquitoes following him. Otherwise, the beggars in the temple would not have allowed him to stay there. When he returned to the temple, Long Qing realized that he was not too hungry. At least, he was not as hungry as when he begged for food from the woman in the wilderness. Thus, he decided to save the half-steamed bun for tomorrow. He covered his slightly bulging abdomen with satisfaction and imagined the taste of the steamed bun softened in cabbage and clapper soup the next morning. He fell asleep soundly. Lu Qinjia led the snow horse and looked at the fire in the abandoned temple silently in the night. She knew that there were many beggars inside and that they were probably bragging about their rewards today. After a moment of silence, she turned around and left. However, she did not go far. She rested in a forest not far from the abandoned temple for the night. She thought that Long Qing did not realize that she was still following him. After all, she was a powerhouse in the upper see-through state. Now, Long Qing was just an ordinary person. However, she had forgotten one thing. As a couple who had known each other for many years, she could clearly sense where Long Qing was even without using her psyche power. This had already become a habit or intuition. However, the fortunate or unfortunate thing was that Long Qing also had this intuition. See you all tomorrow. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 323. Early in the morning, Lu Qinjia woke up from a nightmare and saw his face. That face that had already become somewhat unfamiliar and covered in dirt was so close to her, so close that she felt her heart ache and palpitate. Especially that pair of eyes that were no longer clean and bright, but seemed to be covered in some greasy dust. They also revealed an emotionless indifference, making her feel even more uneasy. "I'll leave now," she said in a trembling voice. "You don't have to leave." "I'll leave." Prince Long Qing knelt in front of her and murmured painfully, I beg you not to appear in front of me again. I'm really useless. I don't have a future. I'm a beggar, not to enter the human realm for cultivation. I don't expect Haotian to give me any adventures. I admit that I'm afraid of death. I don't have the courage to face the people or things I used to have, nor do I have the courage to die. I'm just a rat in the gutter. I'll miss the glory when I was a tiger, but now I just want to eat rotten meat and live on. Living is better than anything else. Lu Qinjia looked at the beggar kneeling in front of her and thought of the perfect man who had once been elegant. Her heart ached so much that she could not bear to touch him. Her trembling fingers gently touched his head and she pleaded with a sobbing tone, "But you don't have to live in the gutter. You can live a better life. At least you should live with me." Prince Long Qing lowered his head, as if he did not want her fingers to touch his greasy and dirty hair. He begged with a trembling voice, "But I don't want others to know that I'm still alive. As long as I'm with you, I'll definitely be seen by others. And if I hide in the gutter and live on, no one will know that it's me in the past." Lu Qinjia looked into the distance in a daze. Her palm slowly fell and gently touched his face. The face that was once familiar but now strange, the face that she had once loved so much. "Now in this world, only you know that Prince Long Qing is still alive. If you forget him, then he is dead. I once stabbed you with a sword in my dream. In fact, if I still had the ability to kill you now, I would stab you again without hesitation. Because I don't want to be that Prince Long Qing anymore. I just want to live." After saying this, Long Qing left the forest without looking back. It was already dawn, and the morning light shone on the dilapidated temple. He returned to the temple with his back hunched. He stared at the broken wall covered with snow for a long time, and then he was awakened by the hunger in his stomach. He went back to the brick wall beside his seat and groped for a long time. After searching for a long time, he still found nothing. The half-steamed bun and the half-urn of cabbage and clapper soup that he had hidden there were gone. Even the urn that he had treated as a treasure was nowhere to be seen. Long Qing looked back at his fellow beggars in the temple and shouted angrily, "Who the hell dares to steal my steamed bun? Give it back to me. And my urn? Where's my urn?" He pounced on the two young beggars who had grease stains on their lips and disdainful expressions. He wanted to snatch back his steamed bun and cabbage soup. However, he had been seriously injured and his body was weaker than an ordinary person's. He was no match for these evil beggars. He was kicked to the ground in a few moves and rolled around in pain. There was a violent cough in the temple. Long Qing kept coughing out blood and was in great pain. The beggars in the temple looked at him without any pity in their eyes. Instead, they were gloating and watching a good show. He wiped the blood stains off the corner of his mouth and retreated to his seat with difficulty. He buried his head between his knees and murmured in pain, "Back then, I lived a luxurious life in the palace and enjoyed endless glory on the Peach Mountain. Why would I care about half a steamed bun? So what if I give it to you? You heartless bastards. Even if I bully you for the rest of your lives, you won't be able to eat snacks in the palace." Outside the dilapidated temple, Lu Qinjia covered her mouth tightly. Her pale face was filled with pain, and her tears fell like dew on flower petals. On the long journey from the wilderness to capital Cheng, no matter how Long Qing tortured her mentally and verbally, no matter how hopeless and painful she was, she had never cried, until now. Even if she cried in pain, she still could not let it out. After a while, she held the reins and left the temple in a daze. She walked into the distance aimlessly. The snow horse behind her lowered its head and looked extremely sad. Not long after she left, the fight in the temple broke out again. It was unknown whether it was because the beggars were unhappy with this new beggar who was dirtier and smellier than them but seemed to be out of place, or because Long Qing's murmurs had angered some people. Anyway, it was another beating. A clear cut appeared on Long Qing's face. The blood washed away the dust on his face, revealing his skin that was as smooth as jade. However, his perfect face was still ruined. Long Qing touched his face and looked at the blood in his palm. Suddenly, he laughed crazily and stretched out his right foot to trip a beggar. Then, he took out the broken bowl from his clothes and smashed it hard on the beggar's face. The porcelain shards cut deeply into the beggar's cheek. One of them went deep into his eye socket and suddenly appeared on his eyeball. Blood splattered everywhere. The scene was extremely terrifying and everyone in the temple exclaimed. Long Qing then used the broken bowl shard to cut the beggar's throat. Murder! Murder! The beggars surrounded with weapons and shouted in horror. However, no one dared to stop Long Qing because there was no emotion on Long Qing's face. That kind of dullness was extremely terrible. The beggar died after kicking twice, but Long Qing still did not stop. He kept punching the beggar's face. No matter how weak his fists were, he could still smash a person's face into pieces like cotton after dozens or hundreds of punches. Blood oozed from the cotton and washed away the flat eyeball that had fallen out of the eye socket. The indifference on Long Qing's face gradually melted with the beating. His eyebrows and eyes gradually twisted and turned into a strange expression that seemed to be crying and laughing. There was no light or darkness in his dim eyes. He rode on the dead beggar's body and cried loudly. The steamed bun was frozen hard like a stick. It can only be eaten after being soaked in cabbage soup. Don't you know the original soup is the original food? How can you eat it like that? Why do you have to follow me? I have no steamed bun to eat because of you. Who will give me steamed bun in the future? He kept howling like a madman in the ruined temple. The cowardly beggars had already scattered in all directions like frightened birds. Those bold beggars who didn't want to leave this rare shelter hid in the corner in fear. Looking at the terrifying madman, someone cried out in a trembling voice, "Don't worry, we drank the cabbage and clam soup, but we haven't eaten the steamed bun, it's too hard." Long Qing looked at the beggar blankly and asked, "Then where is my steamed bun?" The man pointed to the beggar's body under him and said, "In his arms." Long Qing fumbled for the half-hard steamed bun from the beggar's body and stared at it for a long time. Suddenly, he dipped the steamed bun into the blood and asked, "Can it be soaked in blood?" No one in the ruined temple dared to answer his question. When the group of beggars saw him put the steamed bun dipped in blood into his mouth, they were even more silent. Then, they had some very strange ideas. Would it be better to follow such a madman in this world full of human blood? But they did not know that the madman in the ruined temple who dipped the steamed bun in human blood was now a beggar, but he used to be a real prince. Even if he became a prince among beggars in the future, what was the point? Recently, the atmosphere in Tuyang City, which was located in the farthest northeast border of the Tang Empire, was particularly unusual. When 1,000 black-armored cavalrymen returned from the wilderness, the atmosphere became more and more intense. Even the wolves in Min Mountain far away from the city seemed to be afraid of the atmosphere here and did not dare to howl at night. The reason for this was naturally related to the 1,000 black-armored cavalrymen. The soldiers and civilians in the city had vaguely heard the news. The military ministry of Chang and had sent a stern letter to inquire why such an important transfer of troops had not been heard from either the military ministry or the palace. They demanded the general to give an immediate explanation. However, the general's mansion expressed silence. General Xiahou claimed to be recuperating from illness, and the 2 vermilion gates had not been opened for a long time. Suddenly, the gates of the general's mansion were opened. The soldiers and civilians in the city knew that something big was about to happen. They were very surprised and wondered who was worthy of General Xiahou's solemn treatment. A shabby horse carriage slowly entered Tuyang City under the gaze of countless people. Compared with the shabby carriage that could fall apart at any time, the big black horse that pulled the carriage was unusually handsome and very tall. When it shook its head, it looked very simple and happy. The soldiers and civilians of the frontier fortress had seen many war horses, but they had never seen such a mount. They could not help but wonder who was in the carriage and how could he be so extravagant as to use such a horse to pull the carriage. A corner of the window curtain was lifted. Ning Kei in the carriage looked at a beggar under the city wall and thought of something. After a moment of silence, he said, "No matter how hard it was for me in Sangsang back then, we never thought of begging." Eldest brother looked at him and asked with slight surprise, "Why?" Ning Kei looked at the broken bowl in front of the beggar and said, "Because things that are obtained by begging are always easily taken away by others, and the food that I beg for is not delicious. Compared to beggars, I would rather rob." Mo Shanshan did not understand the logic of his words. She thought carefully for a moment and said, "Are thieves and robbers more worthy of understanding and sympathy than beggars? This is the crux of the problem." Ning Kei put down the curtain and looked at Mo Shanshan seriously. He said, "Understanding and sympathy are very cheap emotions. This world is always dangerous. If you want to live, you have to learn to reject these emotions. You can't let yourself be immersed in these emotions. I have always thought that those who pretend to be lonely, pretend to be desperate, cry, hurt themselves and their families, and think that the whole world has wronged them are the trash of the trash." To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 324. Ever since the Battle of the Academy, Ning Kei and Prince Long Qing had often been mentioned in the same breath by people in the cultivation world. Although most people thought that Ning Kei was not qualified enough, in fact, many people had already regarded the two as legendary lifelong enemies. In Ning Kei's view, lifelong enemies was a hot-blooded and even a little melodramatic. For example, Master Lotus and youngest uncle were lifelong enemies in many people's eyes. Master Lotus probably had the same thought deep down, which was why he was so envious and jealous. However, youngest uncle probably had no such interest. After all, it was just a matter of strength and state. As long as one was strong enough, he was qualified to ignore the other's suffering and struggle. Standing under the pine tree on the highest peak, why look back at the scenery of the long road of cultivation where his former companions and enemies had spent countless times more effort to reach the mountainside? Ning Kei, who was in the carriage, did not know what had happened to Prince Long Qing. After shooting the primordial 13 arrow, he knew that Prince Long Qing was crippled. Even if he was not dead, he was bound to be crippled. This was because a beautiful son of West Hill who had grown up in the palace and under the protection of Hautian Taoism could not be like him, who could ignore all hardships and face all obstacles with a smile and coldness, and then overcome them. It was precisely because of this that he no longer regarded Prince Long Qing as his life goal or imaginary enemy after he ascended to the peak of the back mountain of the academy. No matter what adventures Prince Long Qing would have in the future, he firmly believed that as long as he defeated Prince Long Qing once, he could defeat Prince Long Qing countless times. Ning Kei lifted the curtains again and looked at the unfamiliar Tuyang city. In autumn, when he brought the students of the academy to the front line for practice, they had passed by Tuyang City. However, at that time, Xiaohou did not receive the students of the academy. The team passed by in a hurry, and he did not take a good look at the scenery of Tuyang City. One should know that the scenery here had a special meaning to him. The significance was that Tuyang City was the place where Blackie had lived and fought, and Blackie was the first friend he truly trusted in the first half of his miserable and unspeakable life. He looked at the half-closed door of the grain store by the roadside, looked at the strange-looking watchtower on the city wall, and remembered the letters he received from afar when he was in the city of Wei. He remembered that Blackie had mentioned these places and what he had done in these places. Darky was already dead. He died in the cool spring rain, under the grey wall opposite the old brush pen shop. Ning Kei looked at the scenery outside the window and missed the person he would never see again. He felt a little strange. In the carriage, eldest brother and Mo Shanshan looked at him quietly. They could tell that he was in a strange mood at this time, but they did not know the real reason for it. They thought it was because they were about to enter the general's mansion to meet Xia Ho. Ning Ke was a little nervous thinking about the horse gang on the grassland and the tomes of arcane. The military can confirm Lin Ling's identity. Eldest brother patted him on the shoulder and said gently, whether Xia Ho admits to it or not, the crime of his subordinate organizing the horse gang on the grassland to rob the army's grain is enough. Ning Ke smiled. Ning Ke smiled. In fact, he did not quite understand why eldest brother had brought him to Tuyang City. He also did not know how to interpret what eldest brother had said about the confession that day. He had already obtained enough evidence about the horse gang in the grassland, but this alone was not enough to hurt Xia Ho. As for the punch that Xia Ho had used to snatch the tomes of arcane at the Hulun Sea and the Tang Empire's cavalry that had arrived later, it was not enough to knock Xia Ho to the ground. The main gate of the general's mansion was thick and wide, and the long street was swept clean. All the subordinates of deputy generals and captains respectfully accompanied at the side. Compared to the environment, the horse carriage looked even more simple and crude. The horse carriage did not stop at the gate of the mansion, but directly drove into the general's mansion. The generals of the border army who were ordered to accompany outside the mansion were even more shocked. They wondered who was in the horse carriage and how could he have such a big influence. It should be known that General Xia Ho was one of the most important figures in the empire's military. Even people from the palace were not qualified to enter. They did not alight in front of the general's mansion because the identity of the person in the horse carriage was different. People like eldest brother rarely appeared in the secular world. His occasional appearance was just a glimpse. If people knew that he had come to Tuyang City, it would not be good for the imperial court or Xia Ho. The horse carriage drove into the depths of the general's mansion and stopped by a winter garden. A scholar named Gu Shi respectfully welcomed the three into the garden. Ning Ke looked at the man's back and suddenly shook his head. General Xia Ho welcomed them at the stone gate at the entrance of the garden. His expression was calm, but one could not tell what his state of mind was. It had been some time since the incident at the Hulun Sea. When they met again, both sides had a tacit understanding not to mention the fight for the tomes of arcane that day. They just greeted each other as if it was their first meeting. There was a homely banquet in the winter garden. There were no cruel and extravagant dishes like the rumored monkey's head, and there were no rumors of General Xia Ho killing a cook to test the guts of his guests. There were only simple dishes and three-colored rice porridge on the black wooden table. Everyone at the table ate in silence and no one spoke. Ning Ke drank a bowl of rice porridge and picked up the exquisite pickled vegetables with his chopsticks. He drank another bowl of rice porridge and picked up the vegetables with his chopsticks. He picked up the vegetables with his chopsticks for a while and suddenly raised his head to look at Xia Ho at the head of the table. When there was silence, one sentence was like thunder. When there was silence, one look was like lightning. As a guest, it was very rude to look directly at the host. As the youngest brother of the academy, it was a little unreasonable for him to do this when his senior brother was present. So Ning Ke did it because he really wanted to see this person for himself. Eldest brother looked at him strangely, then smiled and lowered his head to eat the porridge. He seemed to think that the porridge was much more interesting than Xia Ho, youngest brother, and the faintly fluctuating aura during the banquet. Mo Shanshan looked up at him, puzzled and worried. Seeing that Ning Ke's expression was normal, she ignored him and looked somewhere else. It was always the ice pond and frost trees in the winter garden. Xia Ho still lowered his head and ate slowly and seriously, as if he could not feel Ning Ke's gaze deeply cutting into his face like two knives. He looked calm and composed. Ning Ke looked at Xia Ho quietly. At this moment, Xia Ho was a completely different person from the middle-aged man at the Hulun Sea. His face was still as cold iron, his eyebrows were still as thick as black silkworms, and his lips were still as red as thick blood. However, His extremely domineering power was all locked in the ordinary clothes on his body, and not a single bit leaked to the world. The seemingly ordinary plain clothes were neither armor nor military uniform, but the imperial clothes that the Tang Emperor had personally draped on him when they discussed military merits. Xia Ho, who wore the imperial clothes, was not only a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, but also a bigwig in the secular world, the person with the most power in the imperial military. Ning Ke silently thought that it would be difficult even for the academy to explain to such a bigwig. Xia Ho slowly and seriously ate the porridge in his bowl, even more leisurely than eldest brother. After a long time, he finally finished eating and slowly raised his head. He looked back at Ning Ke's gaze and asked, "Why do you keep looking at me?" Ning Ke smiled and said, "Because the great general is mighty." Of course, no one believed this, but no one was bored enough to expose this excuse, unless second brother suddenly came to Tiang City. Perhaps only then would he be interested in criticizing the hypocrisy and rudeness of both sides. After removing the food and drinks, Xia Ho served the expensive Yanxi black tea. He looked at eldest brother and said, "My sons are all useless trash, so I won't call them out for Mr. First to see." Eldest brother smiled slightly and slowly sipped his tea. When he did not need to speak, he was always unwilling to speak, because he knew that others would not like to hear him speak slowly. Xia Ho held the teacup and looked at Mo Shanshan. He said, "Are you the calligraphy addict?" Eldest brother put down the teacup and said with a smile, "Shanshan is now my sister." Xia Ho slightly squinted and seemed a little surprised. He did not understand how this female talisman master from the Great River Kingdom had such a big lucky chance. After a moment of silence, he said, "Congratulations." Mo Shanshan knew that the following conversation in the winter courtyard was related to the internal affairs of the Tang Empire. She stood up and bowed slightly, glanced at Ning Ke again, and then left to feed the big black horse. It was quiet in the winter courtyard. Only the cold wind blew the frost on the branches, making a rustling sound, like arrows brushing past bowstrings, like the mud on the battlefield splashing on hard armor. Xia Ho looked at the tea in the teacup that was as thick as blood and was silent for a long time. He shook his wrist and sent the tea to his lips, drinking it in one gulp. His long robe moved with the wind, looking indescribably heroic and casual, as if he had drunk a cup of double-distilled liquor. The tea went down his throat like blood, and the general's voice became colder and more solemn, like metal and stone. Back then, Mr. Cook killed his way into the front gate with a single sword. The disciples of the Enlightenment doctrine were either dead or escaped. They were all homeless and miserable. However, the Enlightenment doctrine set the rules by force, so the people of the Enlightenment doctrine feared Mr. Cook like a tiger, but never hated him. At that time, I was still young and had just left my teacher's control. Instead, I felt like a fish leaping into the sea and flowers blooming on the other side of the shore. I was so happy, especially when my sister and I went south to the Central Plains. I joined the army in the Tang Empire and met many good friends. Ning Ke did not look at him at this moment, only at the teacup in front of him. The black tea in the teacup reminded him of many old things, the stone lion, and the blood. He was thinking about the general's mansion in the general's mansion, and then he was awakened by the sound of metal and stone. He frowned slightly. He did not expect Xia Ho to admit that he was from the devil's doctrine right from the start. The world calls the Enlightenment doctrine the devil's doctrine, and I am the so-called remnant of the devil's doctrine. Mr. First is the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy, so he does not care. However, the world does not think so. After my sister entered Chang'an, I guarded the borders for the empire and accumulated merits to become a general. Unexpectedly, one day, Morong shocked the world with a dance. Her identity as the saintess was exposed, and the West Hill Divine Palace took this opportunity to make a big fuss. On one hand, the hierarch lord sent a letter to the imperial court, and on the other hand, the three great divine priests went to Min Mountain to pressure me. Xia Ho looked indifferently at the black tea in the teacup. After a moment of silence, he said, "At that time, I always hoped that the imperial court would protect me, or that the headmaster of the academy would say something. However, the imperial court did not respond, and the headmaster of the academy did not say anything. In order not to let the West Hill Divine Palace implicate the woman in Chang, and because of my identity as the Devil's Doctrine, I had to kill Murong, betray the Enlightenment Doctrine, become a visiting professor of the Divine Hall, and become a dog of Haotian. Thank you for your support. There is nothing else to say. I will work hard to write, and there will be another chapter tonight. I will finish my private affairs tomorrow. At the end of the month, the 26th is a Saturday. In the other 6 days, I will work hard to write and update. I will make everyone feel that it is a sci-fi drama, and all of you who voted for the general night this month will feel that it was worth it. Thank you, everyone. Please continue to support me. I will go and run some affairs first. See you tonight. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 325. At this point, the most powerful man in the world raised his head and looked at the eldest brother by the table. He said slowly, "May I ask Mr. First, if you were in my situation, what would you do?" The eldest brother did not remain silent, nor did he smile. He only looked at a tree in the winter courtyard quietly, as if he was recalling his own story from many years ago. He said, "If it were me, I would probably kill as many people as I could." Upon hearing his answer, Xia Ho laughed out loud, "Ha ha ha ha, Mr. First is such a person, and you have the headmaster of the academy behind you. Who in this world would dare to disrespect you?" Suddenly, his expression turned serious and he said in a cold voice, "But I'm just a surviving member of the Devil's Doctrine whose sect has been destroyed. I'm just a stray dog. It seems that changing to another house to be a dog is the only choice. However, being a dog is also a very difficult thing." Xia Ho retracted his gaze and slowly tapped the table with his steady and powerful fingers. He said, "Because every dog has a master. And I am a dog that seems strong enough to bite people everywhere, but I still don't know who my master is. I am a visiting professor of the West Hill Divine Palace, and I am also the general of the Tang Empire. I can't betray the interests of the Empire to the Divine Hall, nor can I betray the Divine Hall to the Empire. Then what benefits can a dog like me bring to the Divine Hall and the Empire? I can only continue to kill and conquer more and more territory for the Tang Empire, and destroy more and more enemies. Only then will His Majesty not suspect me. At the same time, I have to secretly listen to the orders of the Divine Hall, and help them deal with things that are inconvenient to deal with within the Empire. Only then will they continue to trust me. These days are really depressing. His Majesty still refuses to fully trust me, and the Divine Hall is very wary of me. And once a disciple of the Enlightenment Doctrine like Tang comes out, the first thing he does is to kill me. I'm a traitor. From the moment I left the mountain gate, I was a traitor. From this side of the river to the other side, to this side, and to the other side. This isn't a change between light and darkness. In fact, it's just a remnant of darkness struggling at death's door under the illumination of light, looking for a chance of survival and hope. However, sometimes I also think that death isn't scary. What's scary is the past that you carry on your back, the past that you don't want others to know about. If you carry it for too long, it will grow on your body and your heart. No matter what you do, you can't make it lighter. Don't even think about pulling it out from your body. But the world is always moving forward. His Majesty sent the Academy to the frontier fortress to practice. Obviously, he doesn't want to use me anymore. And if a dog is useless, it can be killed at any time. It took me a lot of effort to live in the Central Plains for so many years and sit in this position. I don't want to be killed. How not to be killed? Unless you don't want to be a dog. How can you not be a dog, but the owner of a dog? You have to have power. Many people say that I am the most powerful man in the world, but you and I both know very well that this kind of power cannot transcend the mortal world. It still exists in the world, so there will always be a rope around my neck. So I want to get that tomes of arcane. Because I want to have power beyond this world. I want to break that rope, and from then on, I don't have to repeatedly struggle on the two sides of the river. I can get real freedom. Xia Ho's speech was very long. During the process, neither eldest brother nor Ning Ke interrupted. They just listened quietly, listening to the vague history, listening to the hidden hatred and unwillingness in the calm narration of the empire's general, and listening to the secrets that not many people in the world knew. Eldest brother looked at him and asked gently, "Why do you say this to us?" Xia Ho smiled and picked up the teacup to drink the cold tea. He sighed softly and said, "Of course I don't want to use these words to change anything. It's just that these words have been hidden in my heart for too many years and I have never had the chance to tell others. There are too few people in the world who are qualified to hear me say these words, and Mr. First, you are undoubtedly one of them." Eldest brother sighed and said, "Since it's useless to say it, why do you say so much?" Xia Ho looked into his eyes and said in a low voice, "Years ago, I wanted to see the headmaster of the academy and ask him to help me with my pain and confusion. I thought that the academy was a place where people like Mr. Cook could teach me, a remnant of the devil's doctrine. But it was a pity that the headmaster of the academy refused to see me. He only asked His Majesty to pass on 2 words to me. Until today, I still don't know the meaning of those 2 words." Eldest brother asked, "What 2 words?" Xia Ho replied, "Wu Wei." Eldest brother was silent for a moment and then looked at him and smiled. His gentle smile contained very complicated emotions. There was some pity, some emotion, and some undisguised regret. "Judging from what you did today, it seems that you really don't understand the headmaster of the academy's meaning. Please enlighten me, Mr. First." Inaction is inaction. Ever since Great General left the demon sect to come to my Great Tang, all your thoughts and actions have been sharp. You have used martial arts, military achievements, and ruthlessness to act ostentatiously in order to stand firm in the surging river and not bring trouble to the person behind you. However, you have never thought that if you had done nothing from the beginning, perhaps it would have been better. Eldest brother said slowly and slowly raised his hand to stop Xia Ho from speaking. He continued, "Let's talk about the matter of Murong Linshuang." The former emperor received the hierarch's letter and was very angry. He was ready to fight with the West Hill. However, you were worried that the person would be exposed, so you killed Murong first to win the trust of the West Hill. How can you blame the Tang Empire for not helping you? Everything in the world is impermanent. If you didn't do anything, perhaps all the troubles in the future wouldn't exist. It's a pity that you were too worried about that person. One mistake after another, until it reached a point where it's irreversible now." Xia Ho clenched his fists and said sternly, "But the headmaster of the academy didn't say anything back then." Eldest brother looked at him coldly and said in a low voice, "What right do you have for the teacher to speak for you? How do you know that if the divine hall takes action, the teacher won't speak for you? Don't forget, if it wasn't for the teacher, how could your sister become the empress of the Tang Empire?" There was dead silence in the winter courtyard. All the servants in the general's mansion had already been sent away. No one could hear what eldest brother said. Ning Ke, who understood what he meant, lowered his head and stared at the teacup in front of him motionlessly. Only his slightly trembling right hand under the table revealed his true emotions. The empress of the Tang Empire was actually Xia Ho's sister. She was also a member of the Devil's Doctrine. In the depths of the winter garden, a thin branch seemed to be unable to withstand the atmosphere or the frost on the branch. With a crack, it snapped and fell into the snow. Eldest brother slowly pushed the teacup in front of him further away. He raised his head and looked at Xia Ho calmly. "If you're done speaking, then it's my turn to say something that you probably won't like to hear. Xia Ho narrowed his eyes slightly. His fingers that were tapping on the table had already stopped. Eldest brother asked, "Who gave the order to the horse gang that attacked the coalition army's provisions on the grassland?" Xia Ho answered, "Me." Eldest brother asked, "Who sent the more than 1,000 Tang cavalrymen to the Hulan Sea?" Xia Ho answered, "Me." Eldest brother asked, "Who wanted to kill my youngest brother with one punch on the mountain path?" Xia Ho answered calmly, "It was me." Eldest brother was silent for a moment. Then he looked at him and said, "In that case, you should retire." Was General Xia Ho old? Be it the civil and military officials in Chang'an, His Majesty, the billions of people in the world, or even the great divine priests of the West Hill Divine Palace, no one would think so. This powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts was still at the strongest stage of his life. His spirit and willpower did not show any signs of withering. Many people thought that when General Su Shi was destined to leave the stage of history due to his old age, he would be the world's most famous general. However, in this insufferably arrogant general's own mansion, in this quiet and slightly cold winter garden, the seemingly ordinary scholar wearing an old coat and worn shoes said for no reason or reason that he was old, and then told him to retire. When this sentence came out of eldest brother's mouth, countless layers of lead-colored winter clouds gathered and came to the sky above Tiang City. Layers of clouds covered the winter garden. The sky was extremely dim, and the trees in the garden showed their old age. Xia Ho squinted at eldest brother. After answering many questions, he only asked one question: "Does Mr. First want to interfere in the court affairs?" Everyone in the Tang Empire who was qualified to know about the back of the mountain of the academy knew that the academy was strictly prohibited from interfering in the court affairs. This was the iron rule set by the headmaster of the academy and all the disciples in the back of the mountain. Without this iron rule, neither the teachers in the academy nor His Majesty in the palace would know who was the master of the Tang Empire. Although many people in the secular world had never heard of the headmaster of the academy's name, no one in the world dared to disobey the headmaster of the academy's words. To be more precise, those royal officials, Taoist priests, and monks who knew who the headmaster of the academy were, never dared to disobey the headmaster of the academy's will. The Peach Mountain where the West Hill Divine Palace was located had become bald in a day. This was the strongest guarantee of this will. Fortunately, the headmaster of the academy often traveled around the world and did not seem to like to talk nonsense. The headmaster of the academy said that the academy could not interfere in the court affairs of the Tang Empire. Then the academy that had trained countless courtiers and was the most qualified to interfere in the court affairs had never interfered in the court affairs of the Tang Empire. The people in the back of the mountain were no exception. Today, eldest brother wanted Xia Ho, the great general of the Tang Empire, to retire. Was this considered interfering in the court affairs? As a general of the Tang Empire, Xia Ho was able to respond calmly in the face of the academy's pressure. He was indeed a top powerhouse in the world. He had confidence and power that was beyond the reach of the common people. This kind of strength was awe-inspiring. However, eldest brother destroyed all of Xia Ho's strength with just one sentence. The headmaster of the academy did not allow the academy to interfere in the court affairs because he always thought that the court affairs were trivial and cultivators should stay away from them as much as possible. The turmoil of the Tang Empire or even its destruction would not make him blink. As a visiting professor of the Divine Hall, you should be very clear about the headmaster of the academy's visit to the Peach Mountain. Therefore, you should understand what is important to the headmaster of the academy. It is a trivial matter that you organize the horse gang in the wilderness behind the imperial court and the Divine Hall. It is also a trivial matter that you want to steal the tomes of arcane. It is also a trivial matter that you are a remnant of the devil's doctrine. Everything you have done over the years is a trivial matter in the eyes of the headmaster of the academy. However, it is a major matter that you want to kill my youngest brother in the academy. For the powerhouses in the world, it was necessary for them to be calm in the face of major events. However, in the face of the major events in the headmaster of the academy, even someone as strong as Xia Ho had to be silent and think about it seriously. He thought for a very short time. The blood-like black brush in the teacup had not completely cooled. He sighed and looked at the winter courtyard that had accompanied him for many years. Since I am old, then I shall retire. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 326. There were many things that seemed so heavy before a decision was made. However, once a decision was made, the weight of those things seemed to disappear in an instant. They would be blown away by the wind in the garden. That was how Xia Ho felt at the moment. When he said that he would retire, he suddenly felt much more relaxed. His sense of perception and his vision became much clearer. He realized that this was the right choice. Struggling repeatedly between the Taoist demon empire, even someone as powerful as him felt physically and mentally exhausted. He had been thinking hard about how to break out of this deadlock. It was not until now that he understood that if he gave up all the glory and wealth in the world and did not fight and did nothing as the headmaster of the academy had said, he would retire before he was old. This was the ending that everyone could accept. Whether it was the West Hill Divine Palace or His Majesty in the Imperial Palace of Chang'an, they would all tacitly allow him to leave the contentious court and cultivation Jianghu. Moreover, Mr. First had personally come to Tuyang City, which vaguely represented the Academy's intentions. Mr. First is indeed generous. Xia Ho looked at eldest brother and said, I will resign from all my official positions when I return to the capital at the end of autumn. Eldest brother looked at him and shook his head. He said slowly, it's too late. Xia Ho squinted slightly and looked at his face. After a long silence, he said in a low voice, Mr. First, I am, after all, the great general of the empire. I have countless subordinates and I have to make arrangements for their funeral. Moreover, the war between the Central Plains and the Desolate Man will start in spring. I need to stay in Tuyang City to keep an eye on this war. Eldest brother stared into his eyes as if he wanted to hear the reason why he had to keep an eye on this war. Xia Ho's eyes drooped slightly. He gently stroked the teacup and said, After all, I was once a desolate man. Eldest brother got up and walked out of the garden. He suddenly stopped in front of the door and said, You are not allowed to go to West Hill. The study of the general's mansion was deep in the winter garden. There were all kinds of weapons on the wall shelves. There were rarely any brushes or books. A murderous intent reverberated in the room. The dim light outside the window shone in and was instantly suppressed. Gu Shi, the military counselor, stood beside the desk in silence. His hands in his sleeves clenched and loosened from time to time. After struggling for a long time, he said in a slightly hoarse voice, I'm not willing. Xia Ho looked at the letter on the desk, which was still wet with ink, and said indifferently, If I can't get the tomes of arcane, I'm just a mortal, and mortals have to resign to their fates. Retiring to the countryside is the best life I can see. I've sent a letter to Chang'an, and I'm willing to resign from my military post and retire. I believe that His Majesty will give me some face. I believe that Su Shi and the military ministry will fight for the military's funeral. If you're worried about the West Hill Divine Palace looking for you, you can retire with me. Gu Shi was touched, but it soon turned into sadness. He said with a self-deprecating smile, Back then, I was sent by the Divine Hall to monitor the general. Who knew that after so many years, I became a real master and servant? The general can retire, but I have to return to West Hill to report. I don't know if I'll have the chance to meet you again. Xia Ho looked at him and said, Don't worry too much. His Majesty and those civil and military officials in Chang'an will not make any trouble as long as I'm willing to hand over my military power. As for the Divine Hall, this is, after all, the Academy's proposal. I believe they won't have too much of a dispute with the Academy for a retired general. Gu Shi nodded. Xia Ho looked at the partition on the window and the dim light that shone through. He was silent for a long time. His thick brows gradually furrowed and he said slowly, Mr. First of the Academy is indeed a generous and benevolent person as I expected. But I don't know why Mr. 13 has such a strong murderous intent towards me. He wants me dead very much. As he said this, the killing intent in the study intensified. As a powerhouse at the peak state of martial arts, Xia Ho was extremely sensitive to qi dynamics. He could clearly perceive the true intention of eldest brother. Naturally, no matter how Ning Ke tried to hide it, he could also feel the murderous intent in his eyes. Moreover, at the winter courtyard banquet, Ning Ke did not hide his true intention at all. Gu Shi glanced out of the window and said in a low voice, last time I reported to the general, Lin Ling vaguely found something related to the death of Censor Zhang Yiqi on his last trip back to Chang'an. There are clues that point to Mr. 13. Lin Ling wanted to kill him on the grassland, which is probably related to this judgment. Gu Shi slightly lowered his eyes and said slowly, 14 years ago, the Xianwei general's treason case was not completely solved because His Majesty returned to the capital early and the West Hill Divine Palace suddenly stopped. I can confirm that some people are still alive, so I am wondering if Mr. 13 has something to do with that matter. Xia Ho was very clear about the investigation results of his psyche master Lin Ling in Chang'an. He was also very clear that apart from the treason case of the Xianwei general's mansion, there was only one incident that could link Censor Zhang Yiqi and several people who died mysteriously to himself, the massacre of a village in the Yan territory. After a moment of silence, he said, these years, I have killed too many people in this world, and there are even more people who want to kill me for revenge. Whether Mr. 13 really has a feud with me or not is not a very important thing. His Majesty and the Divine Hall are happy to see me retire peacefully. Especially since the Academy has already expressed its stance, no one in this world would dare to kill me. No one will allow such a variable to exist. Gu Shi thought of the sharp gaze he felt on his back when he welcomed Ning Ke into the garden. After a long period of silence, he said in a low voice, that Mr. 13 is strange. We should at least check it out. Xia Ho looked at him mockingly and asked, if we find out that he is that person, what can we do? Gu Shi said, even if the imperial court does not care about this matter, there will always be a way to solve it. Xia Ho said indifferently, Lin Ling tried to kill him on the grassland. Although I did not know it beforehand, this time it is my fault. I tried to kill him for the tomes of arcane by the Hulun Sea. This is the second time. Do you really think that the Academy will give me a third chance to kill the core disciple of the headmaster of the Academy? After a moment of silence, Gu Shi said, maybe there will be countless times. The Imperial Court and the Academy can't always count it on the general. That is very unreasonable. Xia Ho looked at him silently and did not speak. Ning Ke stood by the window and looked at the snow trees in the garden. He thought about how such a beautiful garden could be built in such a remote frontier fortress like Tuyang City. He really did not know how much of the military funds allocated by the Imperial Court to the northeast border military had been embezzled by Xia Ho. He also did not know whether the gold and silver that the West Hill Divine Palace gave him had also been turned into the rockery in the garden. When he thought about these things, his expression was very calm. But in fact, his mind was still stuck on the conversation in the winter courtyard. The shock brought by those secrets could not be eliminated in a short time. Xia Ho, the remnant of the Devil's Doctrine, became a powerful general in the Tang Empire and a visiting professor of the West Hill Divine Palace. He was willing to be a dog of the Divine Hall and kill innocent people in Chang'an City and the Yan territory. All of this was to hide the identity of his sister. He did not want anyone to know that the Empress of the Tang Empire was also a member of the Devil's Doctrine. Ning Kai put his hands on the slightly cold windowsill and turned back to look at eldest brother in the room. He thought about how it was this ordinary-looking scholar who did not have a strong aura in the winter courtyard. But with just a simple sentence, he made the most powerful General Xia Ho of the Tang Empire willing to give up his power and retire in glory. He could not help but feel emotional. The sibling relationship between Xia Ho and the Empress shocked him. But what he saw and heard today, he could feel the power of the academy in eldest brother, which shocked him even more. He could not help but ask, "Eldest brother, how strong are you?" Eldest brother was holding the scroll and reading. When he heard Ning Kai's question, he slowly closed the scroll and looked up at him by the window. After a moment of silence, he said with a smile, "Strength is actually a relative concept. For example, the goshawk and the ant. The goshawk seems strong, but the goshawk will never fight with the ant. So the ant is not weak." Ning Kai spread his hands and said, "Senior brother, what you said is too profound. I don't quite understand." Eldest brother smiled and put the scroll back to his waist. He slowly walked to the window and stood side by side with Ning Quebec looking at the frost trees and ice pond in the winter courtyard. He said slowly, "This world, which is either red or plain, is actually divided into many different worlds. For example, the palace and the marketplace, the brilliant divine hall and the dilapidated Taoist temple, the so-called unknown place and the real life full of smoke and fire. It is said that when the chief monk of Xiankong Temple preached, countless flying ants rose from the light. What state do you think this chief monk has reached? Another example is that the Abbey Dean of Jishou Abbey could teach a disciple like Yi Su. Then how strong is he? But these people will never, at least until now, they have never appeared in the human world. Then they are like goshawks overlooking ants. Although they are strong, they will not hurt you." Ning Kai asked curiously, "What is Jishou Abbey?" Eldest brother answered seriously, "Jishou Abbey is a Taoist temple." Ning Kai waited for the follow-up seriously, but there was no follow-up. He smiled somewhat helplessly and suddenly asked, "Is Xiaoho a goshawk or an ant?" Eldest brother sighed and said, "He should be a goshawk in the sky of the wilderness. Unfortunately, he was chained by himself. Since then, he has become a shepherd dog domesticated by hunters. Then, he can no longer break free." Ning Kai said after a moment of silence, "Do the powerful guests of the divine hall all have a chain on them?" Eldest brother answered seriously, "Xiaoho is worried about the empress, so it is naturally more difficult for him. But younger brother, you are not wrong. The guests of the divine hall naturally have their own difficulties." Ning Kai thought of Mo Shanshan's teacher and frowned. He said, "Is it the same for Liu Bai and the master of calligraphy?" Eldest brother said emotionally, "The sage of sword Liu Bai is known as the strongest in the world. Even the hierarch of the divine hall has to treat him with respect. However, Haotian's divine light shines on the world. As long as you live in Haotian's world, there will always be some rules that need to be followed. You and I are lucky to be born in the academy. We are relatively freer and happier." It was a very simple sentence, but it slightly moved Ning Kai's heart. The words like rules and freedom in the sentence made him vaguely feel something. Especially the last sentence about being born in the academy, it was relatively freer and happier. It made him have many thoughts. There is one more chapter. It will probably be later. I will go out and have a bowl of porridge now. Recently, I have been busy writing and that personal matter. I am a little angry and feel uncomfortable. Alas. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 327. Even the strongest man in the world has to follow the rules. Ning Kai's eyes lit up. He rubbed his hands and asked excitedly, "Eldest brother, who is stronger, you or Lu Bai, the sage of sword?" Eldest brother looked at him in confusion and said, "Lu Bai, the sage of sword is the strongest man in the world. Of course he is stronger than me." Ning Ke was stunned and said, "What kind of answer is that? Fighting isn't just a matter of words." Eldest brother thought carefully about what verbal fight meant. After a long time, he thought he understood what Ning Ke was trying to say. He explained seriously, "I am not good at fighting. Your second brother is better." This answer made Ning Ke speechless again. Eldest brother looked at him and asked curiously, "Youngest brother?" Ning Ke waved his hand and said, "Nothing, senior brother. I am just not used to the way you speak." Eldest brother suddenly understood and said, "I see." Ning Ke asked, "If the chief monk of Xiankong Temple and the Abbey Dean of Jishou Abbey are goshawks in the sky, then what about you, eldest brother?" Eldest brother smiled and said, "I am just a scholar who serves my teacher." Ning Ke sighed and said, "Senior brother, your answer is too hypocritical." Eldest brother shook his head and sighed. Not to mention the Abbey Dean and the chief monk, the people in Jishou Abbey and Xiankong Temple, there are also extraordinary people in the common people. How can you tell that those ordinary drunkards and butchers are otherworldly sublime beings who have already broken through the 5 states? Eldest brother was certainly not a hypocritical person. The reason why he kept telling Ning Ke that he was not the most powerful man in the world was because he firmly believed that he was not the most powerful man in the world. He also did not want Ning Ke to fall into some kind of arrogant mental illusion because of the powerful background of his sect. Ning Ke would go astray in cultivation and gradually stray away from the only correct path to find himself. It was a pity that Ning Ke did not understand eldest brother's good intentions. His logic was very simple. In the known cultivation world, the Abbey Dean of Jishou Abbey must be at the most powerful level. His disciple Yi Su could not even fart in front of eldest brother. Even if he was strong, he could not be stronger than the academy. Therefore, he naturally felt proud and excited. It was precisely because of these emotions that he could not accept the outcome of today's conversation in the Winter Garden. Eldest brother understood what he was thinking and said, "Xiaohu is very powerful. Even Jun Mo doesn't dare to say that he can defeat him, let alone kill him. Moreover, he was the elder brother of the Empress. Who would dare to execute him? Other than the headmaster of the academy and His Majesty, very few people know about this secret. Please keep it safe, youngest brother." "Senior brother, I don't understand why you let me hear this secret before." Eldest brother looked at him quietly. His clear and clean eyes seemed to be able to see through Ning Ke's best disguise. Ning Ke looked back at eldest brother. He did not hide anything because he trusted him. After a long silence, eldest brother looked at him and said with pity, "Because I think you need to know." After a moment of silence, Ning Ke lowered his head and said, "Yes, I need to know this." Eldest brother suddenly smiled and said, "Go back to the academy and study hard. You can definitely kill him within 5 years." Ning Ke raised his head and looked at eldest brother's clear eyes. His heart skipped a beat and he felt that eldest brother seemed to know everything, including his biggest secret. However, what could he do even if he knew? In the past years, he had been homeless and struggling between life and death. That was why he looked careless and naughty, but he was actually sharp, indifferent and wary of everyone. However, now that he had entered the academy and become the core disciple of the headmaster of the academy, he had so many senior brothers and senior sisters. What was there for him to be afraid of? Ning Ke looked at eldest brother and said seriously, "I heard that the headmaster of the academy once praised senior brother for understanding the Tao in the morning and entering the Tao in the evening. I yearn for this state. I always feel that 5 years is too long and I want to fight for every day." Eldest brother looked at his eyes and said seriously, "The headmaster of the academy strictly forbids the academy from interfering in the court affairs. Today, it is already presumptuous of me to ask Xiaohou to retire. If Xiaohou really retires from the court affairs, even the academy can't do anything to him. If you want to kill him, the only way is to challenge him. Are you confident?" Thinking of the conversation with eldest brother in the room, Ning Ke walked out of the general's mansion. At the corner gate, he met Shanshan, who had just finished feeding the big black horse. He invited her out of the mansion to take a walk in Tuyang City. The winter wind in Tuyang City was as cold as a knife. The onlookers had already returned home. Other than the patrolling Tang cavalry, it was hard to see anyone on the streets. There was really nothing to stroll about. However, young men and women strolled not because of the street, but who they strolled with. Therefore, Ning Ke and Shanshan were in a good mood. Walking through the half-closed door of the grain store, Ning Ke pointed at the city wall and told Shanshan that there was a problem with the arrow tower when it was being repaired, so it looked a little weird. However, it was said that it was very useful. Then, he took her to an inconspicuous shop in a secluded alley and had a meal of boiled meat. He proudly said that this was the only delicacy in Tuyang City. Along the way, Mo Shanshan watched the winter scenery, ate fresh meat and drank hard liquor. She didn't say much, only quietly listening to him, walking with him, and then looking at him seriously. Her eyes were unfocused but no longer indifferent, and occasionally flashed across them. "Have you been to Tuyang City before?" "I passed by it once." "Then why are you so familiar with Tuyang City?" "Because I used to have a friend who lived here for a long time." Ning Ke bought a piece of sweet potato in a sheltered corner of the street. He carefully wrapped it in 2 pieces of coarse paper and handed it to Mo Shanshan. He asked her to return to the general's mansion first. Then, he walked into an alley and looked at the corner of the general's mansion in silence for a long time. The great general in the general's mansion was about to retire. He had once made immortal contributions to the empire. Now that he knew what was good for him and volunteered to retire, the imperial court would definitely honor him. No matter what, his fate would not be considered bleak. However, the general's mansion in Chang'an had once shed so much blood. Many headless corpses had been burned in the villages in the Yen territory. Darky, who was under the grey wall opposite the old brush pen shop, had died a miserable death in the rain. He really wanted to kill the general, but he knew that he could not do so. Even if he was no longer a nameless soldier in the city of Wei, but a student of the 2nd floor of the academy, he still could not kill the general. Even if eldest brother personally came forward, he could only watch the general retire and end all the past grudges. He waved his sleeves and did not take away any of the past and the blood in the past. Therefore, he looked at the cornice of the general's mansion in silence for a long time. The alley was quiet and cold, and no one passed by. At this moment, a middle-aged man in a dark-colored cotton-padded robe approached quietly. After making sure that no one was paying attention to him, he handed the note in his hand to Ning Quebec. This middle-aged man was the array tactical master of the Imperial Center Administration who had contacted him in the Blue Water Battalion. The array tactical master had a special status in the frontier fortress. It was not too difficult for him to meet Ning Ke in Tuyang City. Ning Ke's eyes fell on the small note. His body suddenly stiffened. His fingers holding the note trembled slightly in the cold wind. After a moment of silence, he asked in a slightly hoarse voice, "Why did you inform me now?" The middle-aged man looked at him sympathetically and reported in a low voice, "It was impossible to find you in the wilderness, so I had to stay in Tuyang City and wait for you to come back." Ning Ke looked at the note, slowly closed his eyes and shook his head. The middle-aged man silently walked out of the alley. After a long time, Ning Ke opened his eyes and destroyed the note in his hand. He looked up at the grey winter sky and murmured, "How could you die like this?" The news on the note was the bad news brought by the Imperial Center Administration of the Tang Empire from Chang'an City. Master Yen Sei, the divine talisman master of the South School of Haotian, died together with the great divine priest of light who betrayed the Peach Mountain in a mountain in the north of Chang'an City. It was a very simple news, but it caused a great shock to Ning Quebec. He had no time to recall their first meeting in the meadow outside the academy, the first question and answer about the Tao of Fu in the farewell pavilion, and the footprints left by the master and disciple in the numerous Taoist temples and old pavilions in Chang'an City. The note was very short, but it contained a lot of content. Ning Ke roughly understood that the reason why the great divine priest of light was imprisoned in the Peach Mountain for many years was related to the murder of the general's mansion. And according to the analysis, he had a strong intuition that the reason why the great divine priest of light went to Chang'an City should be to find him. He did not understand where this intuition came from. Since he received the fragments in the spiritual world of Master Lotus at the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, he often had some very mysterious intuition, and he believed in this intuition. "Master, did you die because of me?" Ning Ke looked at the grey sky, and his mood was extremely gloomy and terrible. If the person who made his master leave this world was still alive, he could still use the idea of revenge to suppress the sadness in his heart. However, the great divine priest of light was also killed by his master. What else could he do for his master? He withdrew his gaze from the sky and looked at the general's mansion. He sighed and said, "It seems that the murder of the general's mansion that year was really related to the West Hill Divine Palace. The person who made you kill that year was the great divine priest of light. Why did you do this? My master didn't deserve to die, but people like you deserve to die, but you never die. Why?" After a short silence, he said, after the great general retired, he would definitely have a few big mansions with thousands of acres of fertile land. In his spare time, he would play with cats, dogs, and maids. When he was bored, he would move a chair to hide under the shade of a melon and play with his grandchildren. This kind of life is really beautiful. If Sang Sang was by his side at this time, she would understand what Ning Ke was really trying to say. Since this kind of life is really beautiful, then don't think too much about it. Standing in a remote alley in Tuyang City, Ning Ke silently thought of his long-dead friend and his master who had just passed away. He felt endless sadness in his chest and abdomen, and then the sadness was burned into boiling ashes. The boiling ashes suddenly accelerated the aura in his body, and his ocean of chi and mountain of snow began to produce an indescribable subtle change. The faint aura of heaven and earth in the surrounding alleys and winter trees seemed to sense this change, and slowly and calmly enveloped him. It gradually penetrated into his body through his thick coat and the skin under it, and gradually formed an overwhelming momentum that could not be stopped. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 328. A winter tree was slanting in a secluded alley. Ning Ke, who had a feeling in his heart, suddenly entered an inexplicable state. He stood silently in the shadow of the winter tree, closed his eyes, and did not move for a long time. The aura of heaven and earth in the alley, the winter tree, bluestone, and the remaining snow shrouded his body silently. The passage in his body that ran through the ocean of chi and mountain of snow became more and more magnificent, and the invisible but substantial Great Spirit slowly flowed in it. When the Great Spirit dispersed to every part of his body, the aura in the passage became relatively thin, and then it was gradually filled up by the vitality that poured into his body from heaven and earth. This process was like constantly eating delicious food, but he did not have to worry about bloating. It was a wonderful feeling. When the Great Spirit in the passageway flowed through the smallest part of his body, the feeling became more and more wonderful. It was like spring water washing his spirit and body, moistening every muscle and every bone, bringing him a sense of warmth, satiety, and freshness. The changes in his body caused some changes on the outside. The thick coat on Ning Kei's body seemed to be full of rainwater and stuck tightly to his body. The extremely peaceful aura seemed to have some kind of attraction that not only attracted the aura of heaven and earth in the alley, but also attracted the things in the real world. There was no wind in the alley, but the shadow of the winter tree trembled slightly. That was because the withered leaves hanging on the branches were drifting towards his body, pulling the thin branches straight. There wasn't much dust on the stone slabs in the alley, but at this moment, it floated up and gradually gathered at his feet. After an unknown period of time, Ning Kei slowly opened his eyes. A bright light flashed in his eyes, but it quickly disappeared and returned to normal. The shadow of the tree under his feet no longer trembled, and the branches of the winter tree, which were as taut as bowstrings, slowly retracted. Only the dust around his shoes was still accumulating, as if his feet were deep in the thick dust. Ning Kei looked at the dust around his feet in silence. He knew that his state of cultivation and strength had been improved a moment ago. However, this improvement was not due to the original cultivation method, but the Great Spirit in his body had become more condensed and stronger. After leaving the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, he had not cultivated the Great Spirit. Although it was a legacy left to him by youngest uncle, he subconsciously did not want to think about it due to his fear of Haotian's radiance. Until today, when he heard the news of his teacher's death, he vaguely guessed the filth behind those bloody stories. Looking at the cornice of the general's mansion and thinking about Xiaoho's happy life after he retired, he felt a lot of bitterness and unwillingness in his heart. He felt a lot of dissatisfaction towards this world. All kinds of emotions gathered in one place and turned into boiling ashes until he lost control of his mind. The proud and powerful Great Spirit in his body began to awaken. If I become even more demonized, will I walk further and further away from this world? Ning Kei looked at the lonely trees around him in the winter and the dim sky that was cut by the thin branches. He sighed. His expression was still calm, but his spiritual world was a little unstable because of the awakening of the Great Spirit in his body. The Great Spirit slowly flowed in his body. It seemed to be unstoppable like a big river, but in fact, it seemed to often encounter some obstacles. It was difficult to move forward in those routes that were similar to the veins of leaves. The pain and extreme discomfort brought by this kind of stagnation made him frown slightly and look a little pale. After all, it was a problem of the state of mind. Back then, youngest uncle traveled the world with a sword. There was no road that was impossible in front of him, and there was no enemy in front of him. He was wild and proud, so he was strong. Only then could he cultivate the Great Spirit in his chest and abdomen and do the Great Spirit in the world. However, Ning Kei's state of mind was depressed and bitter. He was unwilling to be silent. He could not even indulge himself, so how could he bear the unparalleled aura of the Great Spirit? The general who lived in the general's mansion would soon give up all the military power in his hands, resign and retire. In the eyes of everyone in the world, he had already paid a very painful price for what he had done over the years. He had suffered enough pain and made a sufficient explanation to the academy and the divine hall, and had made a big concession. But Ning Kei did not think so. Ning Kei did not want Xiaoho to retire peacefully, just like some people on the oil note left by Joyer. As time passed, no one cared about what they had done in the past. They were forgotten in a corner of the mortal world, and were left to retire peacefully and happily. This was his unwillingness. It was precisely because he had this unwillingness and made his intentions clear that the Great Spirit in his body had been awakened and that his realm had improved. However, it was also because this unwillingness had always been in his spiritual world that the Great Spirit could not circulate smoothly. There was always some hindrance and jerkiness. He looked at the eaves of the general's mansion in the distance and the remaining snow on the eaves. He smelled the smell of chopped green onions coming from the houses on both sides of the street and fell silent. The depression in his heart could be released and the sorrow could be eliminated. He only needed to erase the unwillingness in his spiritual world. But how could he erase this unwillingness? In order to erase this unwillingness, he had to kill Xia Ho. However, eldest brother had made it clear that as long as Xia Ho was willing to retire, the academy, which promised not to interfere in the imperial court's affairs, would keep silent. Under the premise that there was no evidence, the Tang Empire, which believed in the law first, would not punish Xia Ho. Therefore, the only way left for Ning Ke was to challenge Xia Ho to a duel. Eldest brother had said that Ning Ke could defeat Xia Ho after 5 years. However, 5 years was really too long. What if Xia Ho was really old? What if he was sick? What if he had died of old age or illness before Ning Ke defeated him? He would practice hard in the mountains to seek revenge. When he came out of the mountains, his enemies would either be old or dead. Time would carry out the punishment on his behalf. But wouldn't that be the most frustrating thing in the world? Ning Ke knew that there was something wrong with his emotions at this time. It would not help his cultivation at all. Instead, it would be a great obstacle. If he allowed this unwillingness and sorrow to develop, he was afraid that his entire spirit would be possessed by the devil. He understood that he had to do something at this time to temporarily dispel the demonic will in his mind. He knew that his current strength was still weak and did not have any qualification to challenge Xia Ho. However, whether it was the great spirit that was moving forward with difficulty in his meridians or the sadness and bitterness, they were all urging him to do something. He stood silently under the winter tree in the alley for a long time. Looking at the lackluster scenery of Tiang City and smelling the fragrance of meat wafting from every house, he thought of the letters that Darky had written years ago. Then, he started to walk towards the north of the city. As he lifted his foot, there was a soft puff under his foot. The thick dust that had accumulated around his shoes dispersed and floated into the air. Then, it landed quietly on the wall under the tree. The accumulated dust dispersed, revealing a clean bluestone slab. There were 2 footprints about 2 fingers deep on the bluestone slab. The edges were neat and smooth, as if they had been carved by a knife. Ning Ke walked in the cold wind of Tiang City. He could clearly feel that his strength had obviously changed from before. His senses were also much sharper than before. The rhythm of his body when he walked was very clear. The strength of the earth that was reflected by the soles of his shoes was like a drum beat. The skin on the back of his hands that was exposed outside his sleeves could even feel the slightest trace of the flow of the wind. The transformation of his body by the Great Spirit had produced results in a very short period of time. This indescribably powerful feeling made him have a strong desire to prove his strength. At the same time, the thoughts and unwillingness that he had under the tree shadow had also become some kind of irresistible impulse. The strong impulse to destroy everything clashed with the sense of responsibility of a disciple of the back of the mountain of the academy. This made him unable to decide whether he should do it or not. It was not until he walked to the front of the mansion in the north of the city that the clear and steady rhythm of his footsteps finally made him calm down and understand what he should do. In the depths of the winter garden of the general's mansion, Mo Shanshan looked at eldest brother behind the desk and said softly, "There is something wrong with Ning Ke's mood today." Eldest brother put down the scroll in his hand and looked at the girl with a gentle smile. He comforted her and said, "What are you worried about?" Mo Shanshan said after a moment of silence, "I feel that he seems to want to do something." Eldest brother said, "Do what he wants to do." Mo Shanshan looked at eldest brother and asked, "Senior brother, aren't you worried about something?" Eldest brother said with emotion, "Most of the disciples of the back of the mountain of the academy over these years are idiots like me who only know how to cultivate or specialize in one thing. Only youngest brother has struggled in the world since he was a child. So in some aspects, he is the strongest person in the academy. He has his own judgment about things like danger, and I believe in his judgment." Mo Shanshan looked into his eyes and said seriously, "Even if this matter will bring trouble to the academy?" Eldest brother said seriously after a moment of silence, the academy is not as powerful as youngest brother thinks. But I think youngest brother always has his reasons for doing things. And I also believe in his judgment about things like opportunities. In the side alley of the mansion in the north of Tiang City, Ning Ke looked at the tall gray wall of the mansion and decided to go in and have a look no matter what. As eldest brother said, he was a person who was very alert to danger. He also had a very clear judgment about things like opportunities and would rarely miss them. Killing someone in Tiang City was equivalent to killing someone in front of Xia Ho. It sounded a little strange. But today was his best chance. Because Xia Ho had decided to retire today, so he became old. An old lion would always be negligent in patrolling his own territory. His anger after this would be easier to resolve. Ning Ke walked under the gray wall of the mansion. He bent his knees slightly. The powerful great spirit in his body instantly poured into his legs. A muffled sound was heard between his shoes and the ground, and invisible airflow splashed out. He was like a big bird, easily leaping up 2 feet and flipping over the high wall of the mansion. The place where he landed was a gradually withered flower bed. In front of the flower bed was a courtyard. There was a pine chair in the courtyard, and a person was sitting on it. It was Xia Ho's most trusted military counselor, Gu Shi. Gu Shi looked at Ning Ke in the flower bed and said with emotion, "I have been hesitating whether to kill you or not, and here you are. The next chapter is to strive for before 12 o'clock. I am a little tired today, but I have been working hard. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." Chapter 329. Ning Ke pulled out a thorn in front of him and walked out of the flower bed. Standing on the smooth stone ground in the courtyard, he looked at Gu Shi in the chair and asked, "I don't seem to have offended you. Why do you want to kill me?" Gu Shi slowly stood up from the chair, looked at him and said with a smile, "There are many things in this world that need a reason. Killing is no exception. However, people like us killing people is different from the imperial court beheading prisoners. You don't necessarily want to offend me. The reason why I want to kill you is that you deserve to die." Ning Ke slowly and seriously began to roll up his sleeves. Looking at Gu Shi not far away, he calmly asked, "I really don't know why I should die. Please enlighten me, military counselor." The expression on Gu Shi's face was a little strange. His smile was mixed with some wonderful gloominess. Several strands of his short beard slightly trembled in the cold wind. He looked at Ning Ke and laughed, "Censor Zhang Yiqi and those people were killed by Mr. 13, right?" Ning Ke's fingers that were rolling up his sleeves paused slightly. He shook his head and said, "I have never heard of this person." Gu Shi laughed forward and backward. He gave a thumbs up and sincerely praised, "Mr. 13 kills people without leaving any traces. Even if you lie, you don't change your expression. You really shouldn't go to cultivation but stand in the imperial court," but, as the word, "but," came out, the smile on his face suddenly disappeared. He was extremely cold. "Although Lin Ling and I didn't find any evidence, I know that you were in the House of Red Sleeves that day. Especially when I know that Mr. 13 seemed to want to kill my general. That's enough. You already have a reason to die. Killing a person not only needs a reason, but also needs benefits." Ning Ke began to roll up the sleeve on his right arm. He lowered his head and said, "I can't think of any benefits. As General Xiaoho's most trusted subordinate, killing me, a core disciple of the headmaster of academy in Tiang City, can bring you or General Xiaoho any benefits." After leaving Chang'an City and entering the wilderness, Ning Ke often described himself as a core disciple of the headmaster of academy in conversation with others. He often used this identity to bully others. But today's situation was different. He really couldn't understand why Gu Shi was determined to kill him. Wasn't he worried that the anger of the academy and the empire would directly burn him and General Xiahou, whom he had sworn loyalty to ashes? Gu Shi gently stroked his beard and said slowly, killing a student of the second floor of the academy is naturally a great risk, but it will also bring you great benefits. The biggest benefit is that you will no longer threaten the general. Ning Ke rolled up the sleeves of his right arm and placed his fists on the sides of his legs, feeling the chill of the winter wind. He looked at Gu Shi and shook his head, saying, "This benefit is far from enough." Gu Shi suddenly squinted his eyes and sighed with emotion, "I've been following the Grand General for half of my life. It's so that the General can stand on the peak of the human world. However, the Academy has two people, and the Grand General will be forced to retire. Then won't I also have to retire? Do you think I can bear this?" He looked at Ning Ke's face, his eyes cold and filled with a hint of inexplicable madness. He said faintly, "The general wants to retire, but I really don't want him to. It's a pity that I don't have the right to overturn the agreement between him and Mr. First. If I want to ruin this, what other way is there besides killing you, Mr. 13? Hao Tian is always so merciful. As the weakest world wayfarer in the history of the Academy, it seems that the most suitable ending for you is to die." It was only then that Ning Ke realized that this military counselor turned out to be a lunatic. He slowly frowned and shook his head, saying, "But have you ever thought that killing me, Xia Ho, will not end well? Everyone in the world knows that you are his most loyal dog. Who would believe that you made your own decision?" Gu Shi gently put his palms together and sighed with some excitement. He said, "So this is the best time. Mr. 13, you are so weak, and everyone knows that Mr. First has never killed anyone in his life. So if I can still live after killing you, then I will continue to live, even if I have to live like a dog. I will live until I reach Chang'an, the imperial court, and even the headmaster of the academy to take the blame for the general." Hearing that eldest brother had never killed anyone in his life, Ning Ke was slightly startled. Then he immediately thought of his eldest brother's usual gentle demeanor and thought that it was probably true. When he heard the latter half of Gu Shi's words, he could not help but laugh slightly and said, "Although I don't want to boast, it is really wishful thinking for you to take the blame for killing me based on your identity." Gu Shi shook his head and said with emotion, "As long as I am alive, I will tell the world that I killed Mr. 13 of the Academy and it has nothing to do with the general. I even have a way to make the world believe that I am from the West Hill Divine Palace. The reason why I want to kill you is to frame General Xia Ho, so that the Academy and the Imperial military will break off." Ning Ke looked at the satisfied expression on his face and shook his head. He said, "It seems that you are indeed crazy. Although this plan sounds plausible, who would believe that you are from the West Hill Divine Palace?" A strange smile appeared on Gu Shi's face again and he said, "People like Mr. 13 probably won't believe it, but His Majesty the Emperor will believe it, Her Majesty the Empress will believe it, and the most important thing is that the headmaster of Academy will believe it." Speaking of this, Gu Shi, the military counselor who was used to taking care of everything for the general at night, looked up at the grey winter sky. A clear smile appeared on his face and he said with emotion, "Because I am really from the West Hill Divine Palace." Ning Ke did not know what to say. He had struggled to survive between life and death since he was a child. He thought that he had seen through the darkness and complexity of the world. However, at this time, when he heard Gu Shi confess his original true identity and now burst out of madness for Xia Ho, he realized that he still did not understand the complexity of the world enough. He tightened the belt around his waist to make sure that it would not have the slightest impact on the later battle. Then he looked up at Gu Shi and asked, "But how can you be sure that you can kill me?" Gu Shi looked at him with a playful look and said, "Because you are the weakest person on the second floor of the academy." Ning Ke sighed helplessly and thought that this title would probably be with him for many years. He asked, "But my eldest brother is now in Tuyang City. Gu Shi replied, since you appeared in my mansion, Mr. First naturally thought that you came to kill me. How could he care about it? Ning Ke said, by the same logic, does it mean that General Xiahou will not care about this matter? Gu Shi smiled and said, that's right. So today is the best opportunity to kill you. In fact, I have been hesitating about whether to kill you or not. It just so happens that you are here, so I have to kill you. Ning Ke said, for me, this is also the best opportunity to kill you. In fact, I have been hesitating about whether to enter the mansion to kill you. But since you happen to want to kill me, then I have to kill you. Gu Shi looked at him with great interest and asked, now you know why I want to kill you, but I still can't be sure why you must kill me. Can you enlighten me, Mr. 13? Ning Ke looked at his face and thought of the oiled note. The guy who wrote the oiled note had long been dead, and the oiled note had been destroyed by him. But he remembered the names on the oiled note clearly. Among them, Gu Shi was in the very first position. Many years ago, the military counselor Gu Shi had been the most loyal and insidious dog of General Xiahou. According to the information found by Darky in some files of the Imperial Center Administration that Ning Ke had secretly seen through his master, it was clear that this military counselor was the liaison between Xiahou and the West Hill Divine Palace. It was this military counselor Gu Shi who had made the plan for Xiahou to destroy the entire Xianwei general's mansion for treason. And it was also this military counselor who had come up with the idea for Xiahou to slaughter the villages in the Yan territory. With these reasons, it was enough for Ning Ke to kill him thousands of times. But at this time, in the face of Gu Shi's question, he did not make any explanation. His sleeves had been rolled up to his elbows, and his forearms were bare in the cold wind. His steady right hand reached behind his back to hold the hilt, and then he pulled out a slender padao. The blade shone with frosty light in the cold wind. Ning Ke stepped across the courtyard at a steady pace and walked to Gu Shi in front of the pine chair. Gu Shi slowly narrowed his eyes, and his hands behind his back in the sleeves trembled slightly. Obviously, it was not because of fear, but no one knew what these fingers were doing. The bright blade cut through the quiet courtyard, cut the cold wind blowing outside the wall, and cut between Gu Shi's squinted eyes. Gu Shi's eyes narrowed even more, and his eyes suddenly fell on Ning Ke's left hand like lightning. Ning Ke's left hand was holding a brocade bag. There was a strong talisman intent in the brocade bag. It was the divine talisman left by Master Yen Sei. In order to fight against Yi Hongyu in front of the front gate of the Devil's Doctrine, he used one. Today, in the face of Xiahou's powerful military counselor Gu Shi, he did not hesitate to use the second one. However, the divine talisman in the brocade bag could not be activated. Gu Shi's eyes narrowed into two slits, and there was a threatening light in his eyes. Numerous talisman intents with different auras gushed out from his sleeves, instantly stirring the chi of heaven and earth in the courtyard. Numerous extremely fine primordial chi tore the turbulence and lay between the two of them. General Xiahou's military counselor Gu Shi, who was famous for his insidious stratagems, turned out to be a rare and powerful talisman master in the world. Those milky white space turbulence were like black holes on the ground, and the chi of heaven and earth was like running water, flowing away very quickly. The connection between Ning Ke's psyche power and the brocade bag was disrupted and could not be maintained for a moment. The bright and slender padao in his hand seemed to be stuck in a swamp in the seemingly transparent space, and it was difficult to move. Although it was not far from Gu Shi's face, it seemed that it could never get close to him. As if sensing the incredibly chaotic talisman intent and turbulence of the chi of heaven and earth in the courtyard, the air above the mansion became heavy and oppressive. No one knew which cloud's moisture was crushed into snow and slowly drifted to the ground. A snowflake drifted through Ning Ke's eyelashes and fell on the back of his slightly trembling hand holding the hilt, and instantly melted. The situation was extremely tense, and Ning Ke was in an extremely dangerous situation. However, when the snowflake fell, his eyelashes did not even blink, and his eyes were still calm and focused. Well, there's one more chapter. Well, I'm cheering myself up. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 330. Gu Shi had been waiting quietly for a long time. His hands behind his back sleeves had cast numerous talismans in an instant. The most amazing thing was that the casting sequence of these talismans seemed to be carefully calculated. The conflicting talisman meanings did not cause absolute chaos or even self-annihilation. Instead, they overlapped until they finally broke out, tearing the chi of heaven and earth in the quiet winter courtyard into a terrible turbulent ocean. The turbulent chi of heaven and earth formed by countless talismans was like a violent ocean, shrouding the entire courtyard. Talisman meanings were used to cut off the connection between the cultivator's psyche power and the talisman paper or natal item. This kind of talisman casting technique was extremely marvelous. It could be imagined how long Gu Shi had been immersed in talisman Taoism and how powerful he was. Fortunately, the turbulent chi of heaven and earth rotated rapidly, and its speed was not fast on a large scale, so it could not hurt Ning Kei's body immediately. However, Gu Shi had successfully prevented Ning Kei from casting talismans. From this point of view, from the beginning, he had guessed that Ning Kei's real killing move was not the Padao, but the brocade pouch. The talisman in the brocade pouch could only be cast by psyche power. Ning Kei seemed to have no choice but to be captured. However, his expression did not change. He turned his wrist, and the Padao, which seemed to have fallen into a swamp, began to buzz. The fine talisman lines on the surface of the Padao began to shine. The divine talisman left by his master was separated by the brocade pouch, so he could not communicate with it through psyche power. However, he had been holding the Padao tightly in his hand, so he could naturally communicate with it through skin contact. In an instant, the talisman lines carefully made by the Academy's senior brothers began to show their real power. The blade cut through the turbulence with a swish and chopped toward Gu Shi's face. Ning Kei, who was waving the Padao, had no expression on his face. There was no expression on Gu Shi's face either. He looked at the Padao coming toward him, as if he could not feel the cold aura carried by the blade. His right hand, which was behind his back sleeves, appeared between the two of them. The seemingly ordinary finger, like the snowflakes falling in the courtyard at this time, gently fell on the surface of the Padao. The Padao's talisman had just been formed, and it had just cut through the mud-like turbulent ocean, so its speed was slow. That was why the finger could so easily fall on the surface of the Padao. But what could a finger do to this soul-devouring cold Padao? His finger stroked across the surface of the Padao. As his finger moved, the complicated seal lines on the surface of the Padao suddenly dimmed. Those powerful seal essences then disappeared without a trace. There was actually an extremely small seal paper under his finger, and that seal paper was continuously releasing powerful seal essences as his finger moved. That finger finally came to the hilt of the knife. The formation lines on the slender and long knife lost their original bright luster, turning into an extremely ordinary iron. It no longer had the power to push forward. This battle was very strange. Ning Kei's state and strength could not be fully displayed at all before he was defeated by his opponent. Whether it was the brocade pouch in his left hand or the Padao in his right hand, it seemed that his opponent knew all his fighting techniques and had prepared them in advance, so that he could not use them at all and could only wait for death in silence. Gu Shi's eyes narrowed into two slits. He quietly looked at Ning Kei's face close at hand and said, "You're dead." Ning Kei felt that the Padao was as heavy as a hill, but he did not speak. Gu Shi looked at him and calmly said, "That spring at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road, you killed 3 of my subordinates, so I knew you had 3 Padaos. I prepared a lot of talismans and means for it, so even if you had more padeos, it would be meaningless. In addition, I was very clear that you were the successor of Master Yen Sei. Although I did not know whether the master would give you a few divine talismans, I naturally had to make some preparations. I even sent someone to investigate which Taoist temples, Buddhist temples, and pavilions Master Yen Sei had taken you to when he took you to study, in order to evaluate your state of talisman Taoism. Believe me, although you had not yet displayed those poor little fireballs, I had also carefully prepared for it. Ning Ke silently looked at him. Your psyche power is strong, but your ocean of qi and snow has only opened 10 apertures. Your cultivation is in the lower state of see-through, and your control of the qi of heaven and earth is very poor. You come from the frontier fortress of City of Wei, and your bladesmanship is fierce and accurate, like the style of the military. You have a tough temperament and are good at close combat. You are the successor of the divine talisman master, but because your enlightenment time is too short, you are not good at talisman Taoism. So I let you get close to me and let you use your padao as a camouflage to move talismans, so that I could take all the opportunities. Gu Shi sincerely regretted and said, the battle between two people is like the war between two countries. It needs the most perfect and accurate information. The more prepared you are, the easier it is to win. You don't even know that I am also a talisman master. How can you kill me? But I know everything about you, so you can't even play 10% of your real strength in front of me. How can you not be killed by me? Ning Ke looked at his eyes and suddenly asked, why do you know so much about me? Because I am a military counselor. What I am best at is collecting, sorting and analyzing information. As long as I start paying attention, there are no secrets in this world that I don't know. Gu Shi finally said, in fact, what makes me most vigilant about you is the iron box that few people have seen. But I don't know why you didn't take it with you today. Or do you think that a military counselor who only knows how to play tricks is not enough to make you reveal all your secrets? As a military counselor, I very much welcome any underestimation of the enemy. In a corner of the winter garden of the general's mansion. After a moment of silence, Xiahou slowly said, after the 15th, you should return to the capital city immediately. Don't delay. Ask your mother to go back to her hometown and clean up the old yard. Take out the pickles in the cellar and dry them to reduce the bitter taste. It will taste good to cook white meat in the next winter. But you can't leave the capital city. Stay in the mansion and don't contact those princes and ministers. Don't even go to the prince's mansion. 2 young generals were kneeling in front of the desk. They were his 2 sons, one called Xiahou Jin and the other Xiahou Duan. Under the strict upbringing of their families, the 2 of them were as obedient as their names, completely lacking the slightest domineering and arrogant attitude. Usually, the 2 of them didn't even dare to breathe heavily in front of their father. But today, they heard the disheartened tone in their father's words and guessed that their father was going to resign and retire. They couldn't help but be shocked. Thinking of the mysterious carriage that came to the winter courtyard today, they couldn't help but ask, Father, who are those people today? How dare they? Xiahou looked at the cup of thick tea on the table and said expressionlessly, don't guess and don't be meddlesome. The return of the 2 of you to the capital city is my promise to the headmaster of the academy and his majesty. If you don't want the family to be destroyed, behave yourself. Suddenly, his thick eyebrows that were like silkworms frowned. A few very fine lines appeared on the cup of thick and mellow black tea on the table. Xiahou turned his head and looked out of the window. He knew that Gu Shi should have taken action at this time. He didn't know how Gu Shi had arranged it, just like he didn't know the details of the grassland horse gang's attack on the grain team. He only knew that although Gu Shi had some ideas that even he didn't know, he was absolutely loyal to him and could ensure that he wouldn't be implicated after Ning Ke's death. But would Mr. First really make a mistake? In another corner of the winter courtyard of the general's mansion. Eldest brother looked out of the window at the north and then lowered his head to continue reading. Shanshan sat quietly at the other side of the desk and wrote small regular script. Just as Gu Shi had calculated, eldest brother thought that Ning Ke was killing people at this time. He didn't expect that Ning Ke was being killed. The reason why he was so sure was not because he had made a mistake like Xiahou thought, but because, as he had said to Shanshan before, he trusted Ning Ke's choice very much. A few days ago, when he traveled around with his teacher, he once passed by the city of Wei and made a home visit to his youngest brother. He knew his youngest brother's growth experience, so he believed that although his youngest brother's strength was indeed a little bad, his sensitivity to danger and grasp of timing were definitely the best in the back of the mountain. He would never take action unless he was absolutely sure. Now that he had taken action, he would definitely win. The powerful talisman intent emitted by countless talisman characters turned the courtyard into a raging sea. The chi of heaven and earth was torn into turbulence. The cultivator's psyche power could not penetrate through it, let alone use the chi of heaven and earth to fight against the enemy. The divine talisman in the brocade bag could not be activated at all. The talisman lines on the padao were gathered into ordinary patterns by the fu paper under the fingertips. His body was surrounded by dangerous turbulence of primordial chi. An ordinary person's body would split open and spurt blood as long as he touched it. No matter how one looked at it, Ning Ke had become a moth in a net and could no longer survive. However, the military counselor Gu Shi did not know another thing. Ning Ke indeed could not control the chi of heaven and earth in the courtyard, but his own body had enough chi of heaven and earth, the Great Spirit. In the cold wind and snow, Ning Ke took a deep breath. His mind turned slightly in his sense of perception, and the snow mountain on his waist suddenly warmed up. The Great Spirit accumulated in the passage in his abdomen instantly gushed out and poured into every part of his body. The padao's momentum had been exhausted, so he did not choose to transfer the Great Spirit to the padao. Instead, he loosened the hilt without hesitation and tightened his 5 loose fingers into a fist. Ning Ke punched out. Gu Shi squinted his eyes and looked calm and confident. He did not know which cultivator in this world dared to use and could use a fragile body to forcibly break through the dangerous turbulence of the chi of heaven and earth between two people. A gust of wind suddenly appeared on Ning Ke's fist. Countless airflows violently gushed out from his fingers and the pores on the back of his hand, easily tearing the turbulence of primordial chi into pieces. There was a world in the world, and there was a world in the body. The aura between the two worlds was the same and there was no difference at all. Chapter 331. In the courtyard, the body of the military counselor Gu Shi was gradually burned to ashes. The residual snow on the flagstone gradually melted and turned into a strange human-shaped island. What made these scenes happen were the small fireballs that the deceased had contemptuously mentioned. Ning Ke stood aside and watched silently. He didn't know that eldest brother would be satisfied with his performance in the winter garden of the general's mansion. He was only satisfied with his previous performance. He didn't expect that the military counselor Gu Shi was such a powerful talisman master. Gu Shi had used at least 30 talismans to tear the chi of heaven and earth into numerous small turbulent cracks. Moreover, he could make these talismans not conflict with each other. His means were really shocking. In the face of the enemy's long-planned means or plan, he chose the simplest and most direct way to deal with it. In the face of absolute power, any conspiracy was as fragile as residual snow in the fire. He was very satisfied with his previous response. When the fist blasted Gu Shi's head, the sadness and stagnation in his chest and abdomen seemed to be blasted away at the same time. Recalling the thousands of stones in front of the front gate of Devil's Doctrine, he understood a lot of things. Under the shade of the winter tree, he had a lot of unwillingness in his heart. Those things that made him unhappy were the so-called stone array tactics. How to water the stone array tactics. The Great Spirit in the chest was enough. How to cultivate the Great Spirit. When you meet someone you want to kill, just kill him directly. What's the point of looking forward and behind? What's the point of thinking about the overall situation? I came from the mountains, rivers, grasslands, and villages. I came from the general's mansion in the village. I came only to take your life. Ning Ke softly said this revenge poem written by Sang Sang. He held the padao with both hands and erased all the footprints left on the ground. He didn't worry that Xia Ho would catch any evidence against him. He just wanted to prevent the world from finding out the truth that he had joined the devil. After doing these things, he gently jumped over the grey wall of the mansion. A clear fragrance of onions came from a distant house. He was stunned for a while and then walked out of the alley. He looked calm and serene. He didn't look like a god of death who stretched out his bony claws from the netherworld to seek revenge. He was just a traveler eager to go home. When Ning Ke returned to the general's mansion, the winter courtyard was in chaos. The faces of all the captains and servants were filled with shock and fear. The news of Gu Shi's death must have spread. Without any expression, he silently walked to the horse carriage outside the stone gate of the winter courtyard and took the luggage from Shanshan. On the stone steps outside the winter courtyard, General Xiaoho was bidding farewell to eldest brother. There was no emotion on his cold face, as if the death of his loyal subordinate had no effect on his state of mind. Suddenly, Xia Ho looked back at Ning Quebec. Ning Ke looked back at him calmly. Although he had just chopped off one of Xia Ho's arms, Ning Ke was not vigilant at all. Both he and Xia Ho had killed many people and violated many laws of the Tang Empire. Their status was not ordinary. As long as there was no evidence and they were not caught on the spot, there was nothing they could do. Looking at the slightly raised eyebrows of the middle-aged man on the stone steps and the undisguised cold killing intent in his eyes, Ning Ke thought of the unstoppable fist by the Hulun Sea. Then, he thought of the punch he had thrown before and laughed. At this moment, Ning Ke really wanted to tell Xiaoho that he would wait for him in Chang'an and kill him. But he did not say anything. He quietly carried the heavy luggage and followed eldest brother to the horse carriage. Then, he gently pulled Shanshan. Actually, the most important thing to be a person is to be happy. In the simple carriage, eldest brother looked at the street view of Tiang City outside the window and suddenly said, "Hatred can't be washed away by blood. So, killing people is really not that interesting." Then, he looked back at Ning Ke and said with a gentle expression, "I'm not talking about forgiveness. Of course, I don't want you to be killed at any time. But if this kind of thing continues to develop, it will be hard to find an end. And it is very troublesome to be constantly avenged. Your senior brothers and sisters and I can hide in the back of the mountain of the academy and not come out. But if you want to enter the human realm, there is no way to hide. Even if the name of the academy is as heavy as a pig's head and no matter how strict the laws of the Tang Empire are, if the other party is not afraid of death, they will naturally not care about these things." Ning Ke listened to eldest brother's teachings and thought silently for a moment. Then, he nodded and did not say anything. The cold wind lifted the curtain of the horse carriage. Nobody knew where the strong smell of onion came from. He looked out of the window in confusion. It was almost dusk, but the streets of Tiang City, which were sparsely populated during the day, seemed to be much more lively. Soldiers and people all had joyful smiles on their faces. The murder that happened not long ago did not have too much impact on the secular life. Ning Ke seemed to have thought of something. He jumped out of the horse carriage and walked into a local produce shop that was still open. After buying some things for Sang Sang, he walked out of the shop. Suddenly, a loud muffled sound came from the distant city wall. He looked over in surprise and saw several fireworks shooting into the sky, illuminating the gradually darkening night. He stood by the street with a paper bag in his hand, looking at the beautiful fireworks with a smile on his face. Today was the New Year's Day. Every family in Tuyang City was making dumplings. No wonder the whole city was filled with the pungent smell of onion. With the sound of fireworks, the 14th year of Tianqi ended. Night had just fallen in Chang'an City. A black horse carriage was parked at the entrance of Lin 40th Street, but there was no horse. The carriage was dark and seemed to be made of steel and iron. It was engraved with complicated lines, which looked a little decadent because of too much dust. A wet rag reached up from the bottom of the carriage and wiped off the dust in the complicated lines. Suddenly, the lines recovered their original vitality and became beautiful and vivid. Sang Sang put the rag into the bucket and scrubbed it for a while. Then, she wiped her red hands on her apron and glanced at the closed door of the old brush pen shop. Then, she struggled to carry the bucket into the shop. During the Spring Festival last year, shopkeeper Wu and Aunt Wu had invited her and Ning Kei to have the New Year's Eve dinner together. Aunt Wu looked a little hesitant when she invited her for lunch this afternoon, probably because of the disturbance a few days ago. It seemed that she did not want her to agree. Sang Sang could see that, so she did not go to have lunch. She walked back to the courtyard and poured out the dirty water. She stared at the two urns in the corner for a while and then went to the kitchen to cook a bowl of noodles for herself. She did not fry the eggs, but only put a few more scallions in it, and it was considered a New Year's Day. Sang Sang did not care whether the neighbor invited her to have New Year's Day dinner or not. Since Ning Kei was not at home, she wanted to live a simpler life. After finishing the noodles, she closed the door of the shop and climbed onto the cold brick bed. She was born with a weak body, so it was very difficult for her to heat up the quilt with her body temperature. She was used to spending a long time before falling asleep. So, she stretched out her thin fingers in front of her eyes and looked at the burning Haotian divine flame between her fingers to kill time. Then, she counted the notes under her pillow and closed her eyes. On the last night of the 14th year of Tianqi, Haotian seemed to add some fireworks to the human world. She quietly dispersed the thick snow clouds above Chang'an City and let the starlight shine on the quiet or busy houses. The faint starlight fell on the old brush pen shop on Lin 47th Street, on the two lonely urns in the courtyard, and on the wall of the old brush pen shop's backyard. There was a lonely cat in the snow on top of the wall. It was licking the wound left after fighting for food with its own kind in the winter snow. It looked up at the stars and meowed in pain. For an empire to be strong and prosperous, many people needed to put in more effort, especially the bureaucracy that maintained the empire's operation. On the first day of the new year, when the people in Chang'an City were still sleeping or still hungover, many government offices in the imperial court had already started their work in advance, especially the government office responsible for the capital's security. Dozens of government runners of Chang'an local government came to Lin 47th Street with iron rods and rulers in their hands. On the first day of the new year, the gray walls of the alley were covered with thick snow. It was not as lively and warm as it used to be, but had become depressing and solemn. The bailiffs knocked on the doors of all the shops along the street and politely but unquestionably asked the people in the shops to leave. No matter if they were visiting relatives or going shopping in the western part of the city, they were not allowed to stay in the alley. Second brother Wu, who sold fake antiques, cursed and got into the carriage. When Aunt Wu got into the carriage, she looked back at the closed door and thought, Sang Sang is still in the shop. She should be fine, right? Sang Sang was fine. She got up early as usual, but after eating the leftovers from yesterday and cleaning the table, chairs, brushes and inkstones, she could not find anything else to do, so she just sat at the table and stared blankly with her chin in her hands. At this moment, someone knocked on the door of the old brush pen shop. She opened the door. Outside the old brush pen shop were several local government runners of the Chang'an local government. Their faces were cold and even a little fierce. The iron chains in their hands clanked in the cold wind. It seemed that they were not being blown by the wind, but by their hands. The leading middle-aged official was wearing a cyan official uniform. His eyebrows were a little white, and his face was full of vicissitudes. He was the most powerful arrester of the Chang and local government, Tai Ying. Tai Ying looked at the dark and thin little handmaiden in front of him and was slightly stunned. He asked, "Are you Sang Sang?" Sang Sang was a little stunned and nodded. Tai Ying looked at her and asked with a frown, "Did an old man stay here a few days ago?" Sang Sang looked up at him. Tai Ying took out a portrait and handed it to her. Sang Sang looked at it and confirmed that the person they were looking for was her teacher. She said, "He is dead." "I know." Tai Ying said, "This old man is a criminal wanted by the imperial court. You have kept him for such a long time without reporting to the government, so you have to go with us." Sang Sang thought for a while, looked up at him and asked seriously, "How long will it take?" Tai Ying and the government runners of Chang and local government behind him were all stunned. They were ordered to arrest a criminal today, but they did not expect that it would be such a young dark and thin handmaiden. But this dark and thin handmaiden did not show any fear, which was even more difficult for them to understand. Sang Sang then asked, "Do I need to bring bedding?" The next chapter is around 5:30 a.m., to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 332. Being surrounded by the government runners of Chang and local government, Sang Sang could still calmly ask if he needed bedding. This kind of person was either a local hooligan who had dealt with the government countless times, or a ruthless bandit who was determined to die. Obviously, Sang Sang had nothing to do with these two kinds of people, so arrester Tai Ying nodded after being stunned for a long time. Every story had its twists and turns. When Sang Sang walked out of the old brush pen shop with the government runners with the bundled bedding in her arms, she was blocked by a group of black-haired men in cyan clothes, cyan pants and cyan shoes. The government runners suddenly became nervous. If they were ordinary men in Jianghu, they would not dare to confront the imperial court. However, they knew that these black-haired men were members of the Fish Dragon Gang, and the Fish Dragon Gang was the hired thugs of the imperial court. These days, the old brush pen shop had been a key target of the Fish Dragon Gang. They had long been alarmed by the arrest of the government runners of Chang and local government. Especially when they saw Tai Ying enter the old brush pen shop, the gang members responsible for monitoring the place did not dare to neglect and informed Mr. Qi at the fastest speed. Sang Sang greeted Mr. Qi. Her small body held the large bedding and half-squatted to salute, which looked a little funny. Mr. Qi nodded and then looked at Tai Ying with a faint smile, saying, "Arrester Tai, you should be very clear about whose property is on Lin 47th Street. You should also be clear about the relationship between the boss of the old brush pen shop and the Fish Dragon Gang. You should also be clear about the trouble caused by this shop in the spring last year. So I don't know what you want to do." Tai Ying thought that everyone knew about the bloody incident in Spring Breeze Pavilion. He said that the government runners of Chang and local government had been paying attention to the safety of the old brush pen shop, but today they had no choice. He said bitterly, "Mr. Qi, I advise you not to interfere in this matter today. I just want to remind you that our prefectural magistrate has been in a coma with a high fever since last night. Even he was forced to pretend to be sick, let alone you." The prefectural magistrate of Chang and city was in a coma with a fever. Qi 4 immediately sensed great danger from Constable Tai's deliberately leaked words. However, after a moment of silence and contemplation, he still did not give way. He waved his hand to signal his subordinates to block both ends of Lin 47th Street and said, "This is Second Brother Chao's order." Spring Breeze Pavilion's Chao Xiaoshu was no longer the Grand Master of the Fish Dragon Gang. It had been nearly a year since he left Chang and city, and it was not even known whether he would step into this magnificent city again. However, for Chi 4 and his brothers in the Fish Dragon gang, that man would always be their big brother and their grand master. Second brother Chao's words were more powerful than an imperial edict. Constable Tai glanced at him, leaned close and whispered, "Did you see someone at the entrance of the alley when you came?" Looking at the entrance of the alley, Mr. Chi saw a young man sitting in front of a shop outside the alley. The man wore a simple cotton-padded jacket. His cheeks were thin and a little dark and peeling. It seemed that he had been exposed to the scorching sun a few days ago. Even though he was just sitting there casually, there was an inexplicable sense of iron blood and murderous aura. "Who is that person?" His eyes narrowed. Constable Tai said, "Wang Jinglu." Chi IV's expression suddenly froze. After a moment of silence, he repeated, "Wang Jinglu, the invincible realm below knowing destiny." For the common people in the streets, the world of cultivators was a wondrous and distant place. They knew very little about that world, but Wang Jinglu was different. His fame was so great that even the common people knew that he was the hope of the younger generation of cultivators in the empire. Constable Tai looked at Chi IV's expression and whispered, "I don't know who reported to the Chang and local government that this little girl harbored a fugitive. I only know that the pressure came from the military ministry, and Wang Jinglu came to watch us on behalf of the military ministry." Mr. Chi slightly frowned and said, "Isn't Wang Jinglu the prince's man?" Constable Tai said, "After the bloody case 2 years ago, the palace issued an edict and sent him to the battlefield in the southern border. Now he is a popular man in the military ministry and a trusted follower of General Su Shi." Hearing the name of General Su Shi, Chi IV's expression became more and more serious. Now he was the leader of the dark world in Chang'an, and he had the backing of the bodyguard office. However, how could he fight against the top military man of the Tang Empire? Constable Tai shook his head and signaled his subordinates to take Sang Sang away. However, to everyone's surprise, Chi 4 stubbornly refused to give way even though he was already on guard. He stared into Tai Ying's eyes and said, "I've already sent a message to the palace. Wait a little longer." Constable Tai slightly frowned and said, "She's just a little handmaiden. Do you want to go to the palace?" Chi 4 didn't explain. Hearing the word palace, the government runners were terrified, just like the Fish Dragon gang when they heard the word military. Since the Fish Dragon gang didn't want to turn against them and just asked them to wait, they decided to wait. There were countless high-ranking officials and nobles in Chang'an, and the streets were full of the royal family. Any tea artist could be a cultivator. Therefore, the people working in the Chang and local government were best at pretending to be sick and had the patience to wait. Although Tai Ying and the government runners were patient, it didn't mean that everyone was. For example, Wang Jinglu. After leaving Chang'an, he went to the southern border to join the army to atone for his crime under His Majesty's order. After 2 years of bloody fighting on the battlefield, the once #1 young master of the Tang Empire became thinner and darker. His lotus-like fingers gradually became as strong as bamboo. His temperament also became more iron-blooded and resolute, which was unique to the army. Seeing the Fish Dragon gang blocking the government runners of the Chang and local government in the alley, Wang Jinglu restrained his temper and waited for a while. When he found that those people were ready to continue waiting, he decided not to wait any longer. He took out 2 copper coins and gently put them beside the teacup. Then he stood up and walked into Lin 47th Street. As he stepped on the remaining snow in the alley, the branches outside the side wall of the alley rustled and the remaining snow on the branches fell like snow. However, his cloth coat was not touched at all. The Fish Dragon gang looked at him with vigilance. Mr. Chi looked at him with vigilance. Wang Jinglu walked slowly to the old brush pen shop and looked at Mr. Chi quietly. Chi 4 felt that Wang Jinglu's eyes were like hammers hitting his heart. His body suddenly felt weak and weak. His legs were so weak that he almost fell to the ground. He quickly bit the tip of his tongue to wake himself up. 2 years ago in Spring Breeze Pavilion, I wanted to kill Qiao Shaoshu. Now I think that I was too arrogant at that time. I didn't know what kind of powerful people were hiding in the dark. Wang Jinglu said, but you are not Qiao 2, Lu V, Phase 6, or Chen 7. You are the most useless Qi 4. That's why the Imperial Court let you take charge of the Fish Dragon Gang. However, without Qiao Shaoshu, the Fish Dragon Gang is not the same as before. The current Fish Dragon Gang is not qualified to participate in this matter. After saying this, he turned around and looked at the slightly dark face hidden behind the pile of bedding with great interest. After a while, he suddenly laughed and said lightly, "Let's go." Sang Sang held the thick bedding and looked at the ground in front of her. Then she followed him out of the alley. Puff! Qi 4 couldn't suppress the injury in his body and spat out blood in pain. He wiped the blood off his face and looked at Wang Jinglu's back. He said fiercely, "Second brother Qiao is also a cultivator, but he is as calm and indifferent as an ordinary person to his brothers and neighbors. He will never be as proud of his cultivation as you are. Although I don't know how to cultivate, I know how to judge people. I bet you can never catch up with him in this life." Wang Jinglu stopped and turned around to look at him with a smile. He said, "I used to want to be the best in the world, but later I found it unrealistic. But so what? It's good enough to be stronger than most people in the world." Mr. Qi knew that in the face of such a powerful cultivator, his brothers in the gang had no power to fight back. After all, the Fish Dragon Gang was not an army. However, he really couldn't let Wang Jinglu take Sang Sang away like this. He couldn't imagine that one day, when second brother Qiao returned to Chang'an and asked him what he was doing when Sang Sang was taken away, he could only answer that he was vomiting blood at that time. He had no choice and was really scared. Qi 4 looked at Wang Jinglu and suddenly smiled weirdly. Then he took out a knife from his waist and stabbed it into his heart without hesitation. Death was inevitable under the knife, but Mr. Qi was not afraid at all. He just stared at Wang Jinglu's eyes without blinking his eyelashes, without even looking at the knife. In fact, when Mr. Qi made the decision to kill himself, he was not depressed but happy, because he finally found a way to stop Sang Sang, which was his own death. Wang Jinglu was right. As the leader of the Fish Dragon Gang, he couldn't be compared with second brother Qiao, let alone fight against the Imperial Army and a cultivator who was invincible below the knowing destiny state. But the Fish Dragon Gang belonged to His Majesty, and he was the leader of the Fish Dragon Gang. Even if his death couldn't change many things, it could at least delay the time until someone from the palace came and the news of his death spread to the palace to make His Majesty angry. As for death itself, as a Jianghu man, he really didn't care. Since he was a child, he had been hanging around in the sewers of Chang'an and at night. He didn't kill many people, but he had seen too many dead people, so he had long been indifferent to life. Looking at the knife radiance, Wang Jinglu's pupils suddenly shrank. Even he was shocked by the coldness and ruthlessness hidden in the knife. In the eyes of cultivators, these secular mortals were like ants, but he couldn't be so indifferent to his own life. This kind of ruthless attitude was really hard to imagine. Bravery was always easy to make men excited and respect. Whether it was a high and mighty cultivator or a hooligan suffering at the bottom of the society, there would always be a moment in their lives that was written with the word bravery. Wang Jinglu was also a man, so he appreciated Mr. Qi's decisiveness and ruthlessness. Because of this appreciation, he decided not to stop Mr. Qi no matter what trouble there would be afterward. Bravery to die deserved respect and should not be disturbed. Sang Sang was not a man. Sang Sang was a woman. Sang Sang, who was educated by the pragmatist Ning Ke, really couldn't understand what bravery was. Chapter 333. Mr. Qi was stunned and confused. He didn't understand why he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his right wrist when the blade was about to touch him. It was a burning pain, so clear and uncontrollable that he failed to stab through his heart. He was even more confused. There was only a narrow gap between the blade and his chest. How could Sang Sang fit the quilt in her arms? Because he was shocked and confused by these questions, he forgot to stop the runners of the Chang and local government from taking Sang Sang away. He didn't come to himself until those people walked out of Lin 47th Street. He touched his shaved head angrily, muttered some dirty words, and sat down on the stone steps in front of the old brush pen shop. "Mr. Qi, please keep an eye on the things under the bed and the 2 urns in the courtyard. Don't lose them." Sang Sang left a message before she left. So he decided to sit on the stone steps until Sang Sang came back. He could eat, drink, defecate, and sleep like this. Anyway, he couldn't leave. On the first day of the 15th year of the Tianqi era, it snowed lightly in Chang'an. The snowflakes fell slowly and sparsely on the ground. Some fell on the branches, and some fell on the cracks of the stone slabs. But when the snowflakes fell on the thin shoulders under the thin clothes, they instantly turned into water stains. Sang Sang looked down at the water stains on her shoulders. She lifted the heavy quilt in her arms, which seemed to be a little strenuous. She didn't want to put the quilt at her feet because it would be dirty by the snow water. The whole Chang and local government was silent. No advisor came out to give orders, and no chief judge summoned his subordinates to ask about the case. All the officials and runners were hiding in their respective rooms. They would rather take a detour than pass through the gate of the garden if they were in urgent need. In fact, the officials didn't even allow her to enter the yamen. They asked her to stand on the stone steps in front of the mansion and wait for orders. However, a thin maidservant standing in the wind and snow in front of the solemn yamen attracted many onlookers and discussions. The people of Chang'an were the most daring. They even dared to scold the emperor and the prime minister, not to mention the Chang and local government. For a while, there were many dirty words outside the mansion, and there were even many traces of snowballs on the dark gate of the Chang and local government. The officials had no choice but to let Sang Sang enter the Chang and local government. But they still refused to question her and only asked her to stand in front of the garden gate. The officials had no choice but to let Sang Sang enter the Chang and local government. But they still refused to question her and only let her stand in front of the garden gate. Wang Jinglu had been watching her. Thinking of the scene where Mr. Qi pulled out a knife to commit suicide, he felt a little weird. Could it be that this little handmaiden was a hidden powerhouse? But Qi of Qi in the Chang and local government was to be taken back to the military to prevent the empire from being damaged. Qi military was forbidden to interfere in the case. Therefore, the Qi military was Chang's local government. He thought. And thought. Qi Su Shi, the Defender General of the state, had ordered to arrest the little maidservant of the old brush pen shop and bring her back to the military ministry for interrogation to find out the real relationship between her and the divine priest of light to prevent the empire from being damaged. However, harboring a fugitive belonged to the judicial category. The sacred and inviolable law of the Tang Empire prohibited the military from interfering in all judicial cases. Therefore, the military ministry wanted to ask the Chang and local government to step in and then send her to the military ministry with the charge of treason. Wang Jinglu had sent the name card and a letter written by the Defender General of the state to the Chang and local government. He only needed to wait for the prefectural magistrate to come out and say something to satisfy the requirements of the law of the Tang Empire. Then he could take Sang Sang away. However, the prefectural magistrate of Chang'an City, Shangguan Yangyu, seemed to be getting worse. The advisor looked at Wang Jinglu with a sad face and said, "His Excellency had a fever at noon yesterday and fell into a coma in the evening. He hasn't drunk any water since." 2 doctors from the Imperial Institute of Medicine came, but they couldn't do anything about it. Wang Jinglu looked at the advisor with disgust. He thought that if His Excellency wanted to pretend to be dead, not to mention the doctors from the Imperial Institute of Medicine, even the elixirs from the West Hill Divine Palace couldn't make him get up. When will the prefectural magistrate be able to take charge? Actually, in my humble opinion, if the military ministry wants to ask the little handmaiden anything, they don't have to take her to the military ministry. To be honest, no one in the Chang and local government dares to take responsibility for this. You can ask her in this garden. Harboring a fugitive. The law of the Tang Empire doesn't say that the military ministry can investigate this case. It's just a private inquiry, not an official one from the government. It's okay. Wang Jinglu waved his hand to let the advisor leave. After thinking for a moment, he slowly walked to the front of the garden and looked at the little handmaiden standing in the light snow. Looking at the snowflakes on her yellowish hair, he frowned slightly and asked, "Are you cold?" Sang Sang held the thick quilt in her arms and really didn't feel cold. She shook her head. Wang Jinglu took out a few documents from his clothes and put them on the quilt in Sang Sang's arms. He opened them page by page and pointed at the handwriting on them, introducing himself. "My name is Wang Jinglu. My cultivation sect is from the Dragon Tiger Mountain and is registered in the Imperial Center Administration of the Tang Empire. Now I serve in the military ministry. According to the law of the Tang Empire, I have the right to question you." The Defender General of the state Su Shi was undoubtedly the most powerful person in the Tang Empire's military. Even such a big shot had to go through the formal procedures to question a little handmaiden. It was not because of the little handmaiden's background from the academy, but because he wanted to show an attitude of respect for the law of the Tang Empire and let the academy see this attitude clearly. Wang Jinglu had followed Su Shi to fight in the southern border for a long time and was very clear about the old general's stubborn personality. In addition, the Tang Empire valued martial arts and the military had a special status, so he was not worried about the academy's reaction. That old man was involved in a murder case in Chang'an more than a decade ago. The West Hill Divine Palace accused him of betraying Haotian and the whole world was searching for him. However, he lived with you in the old brush pen shop for many days. I want to ask you. Wang Jinglu was slightly startled and stopped asking because he found that Sang Sang's head was pressed against the thick quilt. It seemed that she had no intention of listening to his question, let alone answering it. He said with slight annoyance, "You are just a handmaiden. Don't expect your young master or even the academy to stand up for a handmaiden. I don't want to make things difficult for you, as long as you can clearly explain your relationship with that old man." Sang Sang looked up at him and said, "I can't say." Wang Jinglu was slightly surprised and asked, "Why?" Sang Sang said, "Young master warned me when I was young that I can't answer questions from strangers." Wang Jinglu did not know what to say. At this moment, a calm and dignified voice sounded in the garden. "Little girl, there are some questions that you have to answer." A yellow oiled paper umbrella appeared in the Chang'an local government. There were fine snowflakes on the umbrella. The person who said this was not the Taoist under the umbrella, but an official in red beside the umbrella. Wang Jinglu frowned slightly. In the past, when he was a visiting official in the prince's mansion, he did not know much about the powerhouses in the imperial court. On that rainy night, he could not guess the identity of Master Yen Sei at all. Now that he was a member of the imperial court, he knew a lot of things, so he easily recognized the identity of these two people. He Ming-Chi could not help but frown slightly. He was probably thinking, since younger brother Ning Ke is a visiting professor of the Imperial Center Administration, why are you so tough with his handmaiden? Sang Sang looked at the official and said seriously after a moment of silence, Master Yen Sei left that horse carriage for my young master. Zhuge Wuren scolded with disgust and anger, you know that's not what I'm asking. Sang Sang was not frightened by the other party's expression at all. She replied very seriously, whether it's the horse carriage or anything else, even if there is, it's all left for my young master. So what does it have to do with you? Zhuge Wuren took a deep breath and said coldly, however, some things are too important. Even the person involved cannot give it to others privately, because that thing is related to the future of the entire Tang Empire. He Mingqi held the yellow umbrella in silence. He disagreed with the actions of the Imperial Center administration, but he had to admit that Lord Zhuge's words were very correct. The big tactical array of Chang and city had protected the Tang Empire for thousands of years. Its array could not fall into the hands of a thin and dark handmaiden. Send the third chapter. Try to finish the fourth chapter around 11 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. You're tuning into the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.